This was a time when art could do this kind of provocation, where people were murdered, killed, for being the wrong kind of artist or making the wrong kind of film.
Sounds like Star Wars fans. And what's happening with the new Star Wars films?
Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two Aussie filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
And this episode, I was going to say this week, but we're not that frequent. In this episode, we are there's three of us because we are joined once again by Stephen Cleary to do a kind of a sequel of sorts, kind of follow up to our sequences episode. This episode is looking at thematic sequences. I'm going to do a bit of a recap of our previous episode on sequences, which you should listen to, but basically Stephen's theory, which we went through in great detail for 3 hours,
With much
was that
wine.
there was different kinds of sequences. There were plot sequences, plot character sequences, and character sequences. And I'll let Stephen summarize them again, but he's come up with this idea that maybe there is a fifth kind of sequence. We also talked a little bit about imagistic sequences, but there's this idea that maybe there is another kind of sequence which is related to the theme, the underlying meaning of the story. And to give you a kind of the idea of what we're talking about, the films that we're going to be looking at are Love Actually, Apocalypse Now, In the Bedroom, and The Exterminating Angel. But first, welcome to once again, welcome back to Draft Zero.
It's great to be here, as always.
In our old alma mater, no less.
Yes, we're back at the Victorian College of the Arts, where we met last decade.
Last decade, yeah. So do you want me to run through the kind of sequences idea, just to summarise it quickly?
that'd be great.
As you said, there are three. Before we looked at three kinds of sequences, which are sequences. Very briefly, are sections of a story. There is no determined length of them. They tend in features to be around 12 minutes on average. Can be longer, can be shorter. In television drama, they'll tend to be shorter, near 10 on average. But again, there's no set length. Saving Private Ryan, for example, has an opening sequence of 6 minutes. So depending on really what's going on in the sequence and what's going on in the story, the length changes. The defining characteristic of a sequence is that it's, if you like, a chapter of a story. So it has a distinct kind of feel that when you arrive at the end of it, you've arrived at the end of a phase of the story. And the sequence is driven in a plot sequence by one overriding question. There are lots of plot questions that are raised and answered, or raised and answered later in the story. But within the sequence, there's one sequence question, which is to say, what is the plot question that this sequence raises, brings to the surface, asks, explores, and answers within the sequence itself. And then usually that answer has a consequence. So because the answer is what it is, something happens. And because that something happens, very often leads you to the beginning of the next sequence question. A plot sequence question is, as it sounds, just a straightforward plot question. So a plot sequence, its main purpose is to kind of drive the plot forward. So in an action story, for example, your plot questions will be predominant. Big action movies have those kinds of questions. Then you have a plot character sequence, where there is still the primary question in the sequence. The most important one is still a plot question, but it tends to be a rather slightly looser question. So it's not quite so driven, and it's really there to allow you to unfold character. So because this is happening in the story, whatever the plot question is, that gives the writer an opportunity, and the audience an opportunity to understand the people better. So the plot character questions tends to be less driven, less emphatic. And it slows the pacing of the story down a little. And in that slowing down of plot, the character kind of seeps through the cracks. So it's a mechanism or a means of structuring to allow the kind of characters to come more openly.
Well, you can spend more time with characters not pursuing some kind of objective, per se.
Yeah, your classic plot sequence question will be, will this character die in the next 10 minutes? So the only thing you're worrying about is what do they have to do to not die?
Yeah.
But a plot character sequence will be something like, for example, will this person manage to attract the attention of that woman? So it's something that's going to be much more leisurely, and actually what you're doing is you're using that attempt that this man may have or this woman may have to attract the attention of another woman to kind of explore the character of that person who's looking to catch the person's attention, and also to a degree to draw the character of the other person. So it's a means by which you keep the story moving forward but not at such a driven pace that means that you have to, stop thinking about who the characters are. Then a character sequence is where really what's going on in the story is primarily you're looking to unfold character, and you're not that concerned with plot. These are much more less frequent. They're more rare because they're more difficult. Because if you imagine telling a story where you're saying within this, say, 10, 15-minute section of the story, I don't really want to have much plot, then the question then becomes, well, why is the audience interested? Because normally what pulls an audience is a question of what's going to happen next. Even if you're having a character go, through a story, if you say, well, I'm having a character go through a story, but I'm not that bothered about the audience thinking what is going to happen to that character next, then you're kind of throwing the audience back onto one thing, which is, who is this person really? And that's quite difficult to dramatise without things happening. If a character's standing against a wall for 15 minutes, the question, who are they really, is very hard to answer because they're not doing anything. So when you take the plotting away and downplay it, then even though you think, well, that gives a lot of space for character, the problem you then get is, but what are you actually dramatising the character doing? And if you say, well, they're not doing much, then you can see the problems that arise with it. So a character sequence is quite unusual and very often quite stylized. So the things that you have to do in a character sequence to keep the audience involved and interested is make it very emphatic and intense in certain ways. And that can be, for example, you could have an intense dialogue section where the dialogue is frantic and very clever and very difficult to understand. So the audience is really having to work hard just to get understanding the dialogue. Mike Leigh's Naked was the example we used of that, where the character is frantic, the character is going nowhere and doesn't really have any objective, but you're kind of just entranced, if you like this kind of thing, by the energy that they have. And so you very often have very energetic sequences using just character. As I say, they're unusual.
There's that amazing scene, and I call it's a scene, but it's also a sequence just due to its length. But in Hunger, the Steve McQueen film, the scene between Michael Fassbender and the priest, I mean, it's in stark contrast because it's so dialogue heavy on a film that has not featured any much dialogue or character up until that point. But then suddenly you've got two people, and there's no plot question at all. Yeah. It's not like, well, it's the same plot question that's been raised the whole time. It's like, will this priest convince him to eat, essentially? But then that's not what is keeping the audience engaged in that scene. It's about, who are these two people? How do they interact? How do they rub off on each other?
You can sit down anytime you like.
Priest etiquette. Never sit before you're asked.
Sit down then.
Don't I come over too eager?
But best to hover at the door.
You learned that your first week in the seminary, boy. Sig.
Come on.
Bit of a break from smoking the Bible, eh?
Why?
Anyone work out which pick is the best smoke?
We only smoke the Lamentations. Right, Miserable Cigarette?
Well, and we talked about, and this will relate to the thematic thing as well, that within those stories, particularly like character question stories, there can still be an overarching plot question at the beginning and the end, but it's the middle becomes character exploration. I think that's actually, thinking about it now, kind of true of all the films, including Exterminating Angel, which is more obscure. There is a plot question that is raised at the beginning of that film, and we'll get into it in more detail, but basically one of the help leaves with no explanation. There's basically a dinner party and he leaves and there is no explanation about why he is leaving. And so that creates the question in the audience, which is, why are they leaving? What is happening? There is something strange going on. And then that's a framing device, and Love Actually uses a framing device, and Apocalypse Now uses a framing device. In the Bedroom is only one of the 4 examples that we're doing that doesn't seem to. We'll explore that when we get to the films. The question that I have, because we did talk a lot about intensity in our sequences episode, and the idea that plot sequences will really have this kind of intensity coming from plot. Character sequences have this intensity coming from often dialogue, which is in contrast to imagistic sequences. When we talked about There Will Be Blood, that's the intensity of the imagery and often music. Plot character dual sequences can tend to be one or, I guess, the other. Bourne, the example used from Bourne was the Homestead sequence where they're out to get Bourne, but Bourne doesn't know. So there is an intensity we're feeling suspense, we're feeling concern, to use Stephen's term, concern for Bourne, but he is unaware, so he's got time to kind of slowly reveal character. The question that I've got, which we can obviously explore for the next however long, is what's the intensity in the thematic sequences? Like, I understand what an imagistic sequence is, you know. I kind of, you know, I mean, it's not... But in a thematic sequence, where's the intensity coming from?
The difference between a thematic sequence and a thematic question, if you like, and any other kind of sequence is that a thematic sequence is not answered by simply looking at the story that you're being told. The question a thematic sequence raises is a question that deliberately is posed to the audience as opposed to played out in the if you like in the world of the story. So you say, where's the intensity? The intensity in the thematic sequence comes from something that happens. The audience is watching the sequence and they're used to, you know, plot sequences or plot questions or character sequences and character questions or plot character, and none of that's there. So the audience starts to cast around, you know, and they start to kind of have to work something out. Now, what happens very often when you have this kind of story is that the audience gives up. Is that a good section of the audience will just go, I can't understand this. I don't know what's supposed to be going on. I don't know who these people are. I don't think I care. And they disengage from the story.
We came to that with There Will Be Blood last time. I was like, what makes this so compelling? And you guys were like, well, a lot of people didn't find it compelling at all.
Yeah.
So that's the question. So that's the danger of it. And then you say, well, why on earth would a storyteller use a technique where what you're trying to do in some sense is to have the audience realize that by following what the characters do, they're not going to get anywhere. And by trying to work out what's going on, they're not going to get anywhere. And then at that point, as I say, a good proportion of the audience go, well, I want stories that if I can follow the story, I understand the characters, this is what the story is. And this doesn't seem to be that kind of a story. So I'm leaving. If you do this kind of work in a broad, we'll look at the Exterminating Angel as an example that I would use for that, but we'll come to it later, then you're doing it for a very particular reason, which is that the whole point is, and it's a deeply sort of personal way of storytelling, is that you're saying to the audience, the things that you need to understand and know are not contained in my story. They're contained in some way in your relationship with what I'm thinking and feeling about. I'm telling you this story in order to make you say, what is the point of this? And in some ways, what you get is a much more direct dialogue between the storyteller, the filmmaker, the writer, and the audience.
I watched Apocalypse Now for the first time last night. It's off my list of shame finally, so I can talk about it. And I went and looked at Letterboxd reviews of it, and it's basically there's a whole bunch of 5 stars, and there's a whole bunch of like 1 star or half a star, where people are like, "This was boring, I don't get it," or "This is pretentious," or whatever. And so in some ways, it seems like these kinds of films can be divisive when taken to the extreme, which is why I think maybe it's worth getting into Love Actually, because it's the most mainstream example of what we're talking about. I mean, prima facie, the film is telling you in its title what it's about, and then in voiceover, just in case you missed the title. So maybe we should start with Love Actually?
Yeah.
Hello. Lovely to see you all.
Lovely.
Lovely, yes.
Right, who do you have to screw around here to get a cup of tea and a chocolate biscuit?
What I really like about the homework that we've selected, because you're asking about intensity, and I'm kind of interested in the same thing, but phrased differently. I'm interested in if you are wanting to use film, be it narrative or otherwise, and I think Exterminating Angel is, and Apocalypse Now, out of our 4 examples, are the kind of less narratively driven. If you want to force your audience, you want them to think about a certain topic or idea, then the homework that we've done of the 4 different films each do that in a very different way. And the question that I'm interested in is how to force the audience to, as you say, Stephen, like sit back and go, what is this all about? While also hopefully keeping them seated and interested in the story. And I think the 4 films that we've got here do that in very different ways.
Yeah, the quick point I'd make is when you say the audience goes, what is this all about? That is, the audience is asking the question, what is the theme of this story? What it's all about is what the theme is. Yeah, that's how you define a theme. It's the underlying idea that so it sits underneath the surface of the plot and the characters, etc. So absolutely, you're getting the audience to say, what is this really about? Is you're getting the audience to ask a thematic question, not a plot question or a character question.
And I'll say this now, but I wonder if it's something we'll come back to, because something that I think other films will tend to do that are even more mainstream is the thematic sequence might be at the end. I'm coming back. We've done theme a couple of times, as Chaz and I talked about before this recording, which is we did our worldview and theme episode and we did our arguments of the scene episode. At the end of Ex Machina, Ava's basically killed her creator and locked General Hux in the building. There is a sequence of her just going out into the world, and it's played with music. It's her getting onto the chopper into the city. And they could have just ended with her escaping, but they've chosen to continue that film, I think, to let you ponder what it means to have her out in the world. And I don't think that's necessarily uncommon. Infinity War has moments after the big climax where it kind of dwells on what's happened there. What is interesting about these films, what we're doing, is that those thematic sequences aren't just at the end of the film, that they find moments to have it earlier, which is interesting and is a device that I think as a filmmaker might be interesting to have other than the climax, the moment of reflection.
And again, when you have it at the end of the film, of course, the main plot question, the main character questions have been answered. So and it's an interesting thing that what happens when you, as it were, take away plot and character questions is the theme bubbles up. I imagine it as like, that, a story is kind of like a piece of ground that characters are walking across and they're walking along. If you take the characters away, and if you take the plot away, the theme, which is under the surface, basically starts to come out like a gas from the cracks in the ground, and it just starts to come into as it were, the visible world. And that's what happens if you don't have theme and if you don't have plot and character running. Then what inevitably happens is theme comes out. And when you're talking about playing with theme, it's about knowing that the theme is always there, but normally it's, as it were, hidden, and it drives and pushes the character and the plot along. But if you take the character and plot away, that theme is going to it starts to rise up anyway.
So going to Love Actually and talking about what makes it intense, I mean, I think why have we chosen it as a film here? So for those of you who have not seen Love Actually, it's a number of different stories that are somewhat interrelated, but they're only interrelated, I think, for storytelling convenience, because the stories, these characters hand off to one another because they know each other, but their stories don't impact on one another for the most part. It's just telling a number of different stories, nearly all in a kind of romance kind of story, but there's a number of different settings. There's Colin Firth, who's heartbroken, falling in love with his Portuguese maid who doesn't speak English.
This is Aurelia.
Bonjour, Aurelia.
Bonjour.
Je suis très heureux de vous avoir ici.
Unfortunately, she cannot speak French, just like you. She's Portuguese.
There's, the famous and much parodied Andrew Lincoln, where he's the best man and he's in love with his best friend's bride and with the sign cards.
Classic nice guy.
Yeah, there's, some of my favorite ones are actually even the least plotted ones. It's the two stand-ins.
So I've got a list here.
Okay.
So you've got the storyline of Juliet, Peter and Mark. So Juliet's the Keira Knightley, Peter's the, I'm not going to present sheer wealth.
Chiwetel Ejiofor?
Yep, I'll let you handle that.
Well, it's probably wrong, but I'm just giving it a go.
You've got more confidence in it than me. And Andrew Lincoln.
I look quite pretty. You've stayed rather close, haven't you?
You've got Harry, Karen and Mia. So Harry's the Alan Rickman character. He's married to Emma Thompson, who is Karen.
Joni Mitchell is the woman who taught your cold English wife how to feel.
Did she? Oh, well, that's good. I was right to her sometimes say thanks.
Who happens to be the sister of
Hugh Grant.
You've got David and Natalie. David is Hugh Grant, who is the new and somehow single PM, because Has that happened?
He said no one's going to fancy a girl with thighs the size of big tree trunks. Not a nice guy, actually. In the end.
You know, being Prime Minister, I could just have him murdered.
And you've got... This is how many groups of character. Yeah. Daniel, Sam, Joanna and Carol. Daniel is Liam Neeson, whose wife passes away from cancer, and he is left to raise his stepson.
Well, I mean, I'm a little relieved.
Why?
But because I thought it would be something worse.
Worse than the total agony of being in love.
No, you're right.
You've got the Sarah, Carl and Michael storyline, which is basically Sarah works for Alan Rickman's character. This is how all the interconnected. And she is taking care of her brother. And she also has a crush on the company's
her Brazilian
predator, Carl, right?
And how long have you been in love with Carl, our enigmatic chief designer?
2 years, 7 months, 3 days, and I suppose an hour and 30 minutes.
For as much?
Man, there is so many.
Yeah.
I mean, should I keep on going?
That's probably enough, don't you reckon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point being is each of these individual stories has overarching, they're very plotted, each of them has very, very clear dramatic questions, plot questions. Some of them have more character-driven questions than others. So the moments that kind of really hit you in the feels are often the ones where they are more character-driven questions. Like, I mean, in particular, the Emma Thompson and Alan Rickman, like, because she becomes aware of it's unclear whether he's done anything, but his interest in another woman outside of their marriage.
And and would you say that's a plot question or a character question? The idea of will Alan Rickman's character, whatever he's called, I've forgotten already, will Harry sleep with Mia? Do you think that's a plot question or a character question or both?
It's a plot question, I would say.
Because you can clearly see it, right?
Yeah, it's observable.
Yeah. But I think what you don't know is, that's more of a character-driven question, is can Harry and Karen's relationship survive this set of plot events? Like, there's
I would say that's the consequence of the answer to the plot question, which is, it's kind of, in some sense, you say if the plot question of that particular story was something like, will Harry betray Karen? And whether he physically sleeps with the woman is not the point. The point is he has, in a kind of biblical sense, he emotionally he's betrayed her. And then the question is, so the consequence is, are they going? And he works out that that she knows that, and that the question is, are they going to recover
him? And it's, to me, it's one of the best scenes in the whole film. Is they're in a Christmas concert. Like that their kids have just performed at, and she confronts him and tells him that she knows.
Imagine your husband bought a gold necklace and come Christmas gave it to somebody else.
Karen.
I mean, would you wait around to find out if it... No, happy Christmas. Would you wait around to find out if it's just a necklace, or if it's sex and a necklace, or if, worst of all, it's a necklace and love? Would you stay, knowing life would always be a little bit worse? Or would you cut and run?
God. I am so in the wrong. A classic fool.
Yes, but you've also made a fool out of me. You've made the life I lead foolish too.
That line gets me every time. And I think where, as you say, the character question, the plot questions are resolved in that it's all out in the open. And now it's just about who are these people going to be and how are they going to react as a result of that.
Yeah. And you can see those in the other story. The Jamie and Aurelia storylines are very... Aurelia is a kind of almost a classic rom-com. He meets the maid, they got language difficulties, they fall in love, and then you've got him needing to go into, he goes and teaches himself Portuguese and then goes and finds her, right? That's a plot question. Will he win the girl? Yeah. what is interesting is they don't necessarily all have that as strongly plotted. Like, I don't think the Juliet and Peter and Mark storyline, which is about her realizing that her husband's best man is in love with her, but in a weirdly crush kind of, it's like, I had no idea, yeah, because it's a weird relationship. That feels less plotted in the same way. Yeah. And then the relationship, which we didn't get to, because I can't remember the name of the characters, the stand-ins.
Yeah.
It's Martin Freeman, isn't it?
Yeah, John and Judy. So Joanna Page and Martin Freeman, John and Judy, are these stand-ins in these porn films, and it's just their relationship building.
Well, isn't
so I
he
guess
stand-in? I don't know if it's a porn film. It feels like a Henry James.
Oh, okay.
Because it's like...
Yeah, some...
Oh, yeah.
It's quite interesting.
Certainly a more... Why would you have stand-ins for a porn film?
Yeah.
Like, it's a pretty well lit... It's like an Italian 70s erotica, you know?
Yeah. But they're in hugely I guess the comedy of that sequence, because it's almost a farce kind of sequence, is that there are these two people who are in hugely intimate situations who are
getting to know each other for the first time.
Exactly.
I thought I was never going to make it here today. The traffic was just
unbelievable.
Yeah. Judy, could you take the top off this time? Lighting and camera need to know when we're actually going to see the nipples and when we're not.
So I guess, I know we've scattered around the place with those storylines because they seem to be, to varying degrees, plotted, right? So where do the thematic sequences structurally come in? You know, to me, there's the climax of the film is almost everyone at the airport. Given that this is that kind of ensemble or a hyperlink, it's like, where does everyone meet? And they all happen to be at the airport at the end. Gives you that moment of reflection. But as we talked about, that in itself is not necessarily uncommon structurally.
The question to ask that gives you an indication of how thematically structured this is if you ask the question, who's the protagonist? Because it's a question that in this story, you know, it's interesting because I've been to lectures and read books and, you know, had conversations with people who will always want there to be a protagonist. Will say, well, you know, and they'll say either think something like there's a group protagonist. So that, and then but then in love actually say, okay, well,
which
they
group
can't
is
all be the protagonist. So is we're the lead character of each story? Are they all the protagonist? You know, and if that's the case, that seems to me to be a bit silly.
Well, I think because there's a number of, they've all got their unique stories.
You say there are a number of stories in this film, and each of those stories has a protagonist. Absolutely agree. Okay, who's the protagonist of the film?
Bill Nighy character.
Yeah, that's you know. You say, well, you know, but again, if you look at Bill Nighy's character, you say, well, how does he, as it were, unify drive how does what Bill Nighy does determine the actions of the characters? He doesn't. Yeah. So the answer is there isn't a protagonist. That answer makes a lot of people in kind of screenwriting classes and whatever very, very uneasy, because there is this kind of orthodoxy that there should be always a protagonist. And people say a story always has a protagonist. And my answer to that is, no, it doesn't. Most of the time, a story has a protagonist. When you don't have an overall protagonist, just as you say, okay, what's the overall plot question? There's no overall plot question. There are lots of individual plot questions, and each of those is just completely conventional and normal, just as there are completely conventional normal protagonists. But if you say, what's the overall plot question of the story, there isn't one. Okay, so we have most films have an overall plot question, overall character question, have an overall protagonist, have an overall antagonist. This film doesn't have any of those things. So what happens when you take away those structural supports to a story? The audience starts to cast around for something else that gives the story a coherence and a meaning. When there's no plot question overall, there's no character question overall, you then come to theme, because there's always theme. And then it is, what this is really about? It's really about love. It's lots of different stories about love. It's love, actually. You know, this is not a great profound insight, you know, that we're talking about. But what it is interesting is to note that there isn't a protagonist. The arcing structures that normally hold these stories together are gone. And when those arcing structures go, the theme is all you have to hang on to. And so the theme becomes primary. And that's what happens.
But what is interesting, maybe having the spectrum of plot questions for each of the storylines helps. So you've got something that is more plotted, which is then Liam Neeson's relationship with his stepson, the stepson wanting to learn drums. He wants to win the girl. There is the concert at the end. Like, that is a very strong sequence. And and also the Bill Nighy and his manager selling the Christmas song. That's a very plotted, you know, I want to be number one on Christmas with this terrible song.
Oh, come on, Mikey. You know as well as I do, the record's crap. But wouldn't it be great if number one this Christmas wasn't some smug teenager, but an old ex-heroin addict searching for a comeback at any price.
I just want to like jump in because you're saying, yeah, absolutely. There's no protagonist, so that immediately forces
you to look for the connections between the story.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
So, but I think what's different between...
And note, what the interesting thing about it forces the audience to make the connections, i.e., rather than normally the characters in the story do all the work for you and you watch them, it says, okay, take away those characters, the protagonists, the audience has to start to make the meaning. The meaning is not there on the page or on the screen. The meaning is constructed by the audience as they watch the story.
And that is in contrast to Contagion, which we did earlier, which is also an ensemble film, but everyone is affected by a single antagonistic force, which is the virus in that film. And that means we know what the fuck it's about because it's about how everyone deals with the antagonist is almost the theme. Like, in a way, it's the idea of love and the way that each of these different people deal with love in various forms.
But I think, so to contrast, so you've got, I think there's a lot of movies out there that are either, you call them either, I'm going to say anthology because it's not ensemble, because ensemble, I think you can have like, Little Miss Sunshine is an ensemble film, but they're all on the same story, right? So this is an anthology. This is a group of stories being told together, and Contagion is like that. But the key difference here is I think if you paused this film at any point and just said, so what's this film about? They could say it's about love because it starts with the bloody voiceover.
Whenever I get gloomy with the state of the world, I think about the arrivals gate at Heathrow Airport. General opinion's starting to make out that we live in a world of hatred and greed. But I don't see that. Seems to me that love is everywhere.
But they couldn't say, what's the plot question that this is, because there is no unifying plot question. Like in Contagion, there is a unifying plot question. And I think there are other films that use this anthology to be very... Magnolia, Traffic, for all its Crash, Paul Haggis's Crash, for all the people bitter at it.
Or over a TV series like The Wire, you know? Like that's a big...
We'll come later on maybe to talk about TV because I think it's this way of thinking about theme is quite specialised in particular in relation to cinema. When you think about television, it's much more common. It's much more useful and I would say general a way of thinking about story structuring than in television series than it is in features.
I think in television as well, you've got the luxury of time.
Yeah.
So you've got the luxury to have scenes, sequences, even whole episodes where you are dropping out of the larger narrative. You know, any bottle episode in a TV series, it will have a unique...
and there's the theme of the episode, you know, American Gods, the cold open is almost all about what is the theme of this particular episode.
Yeah.
Coming back to Love Actually, we've talked about this opening voiceover, so there is a bookending structure to it. So it opens at the airport and with the voiceover. Is that, is it something that these kinds of thematic films, I mean, are they, would you say they're thematically driven, that all these things are ultimately, you watching it not to know character or to go on a plot, but you're going for theme in the examples that we're using?
I think that what you're showing is the audience showing, look, here are however many 9 stories about love. And what it shows is love is a many-faceted thing, in broad terms. There's lots of different ways of thinking about love.
Except it's only straight.
Straight white men getting beautiful women. But apart from that, it's just like... But you know what I mean? It's kind of within the context and culture of its particular repressed English white writing. It is kind of saying, here's lots of stories about love as I understand it, if you like, from the writer, from my experience. Yeah. And the audience watching it gets a kind of warm feeling, and it's not, you're not primarily engaged in any one character story. You're looking at this range, so your depth of engagement with each character is less than normal. Yeah. So it's not completely overwhelming. There's some beautiful writing and some beautiful moments because Curtis is a very high class writer. So the Emma Thompson storyline has got a couple of moments that are absolute killers, a couple of lines, and there's a kind of truthfulness and a pain in that. The great thing about Curtis as a writer about love is that he's great about when love is painful, and much more interesting than when he is when love is lovely. dicking around scenes make me sick, but when Curtis writes about the pain of life, he's usually very, very good. And there's a couple of great moments in that. So there are moments where it really strikes home because he's such a good writer, but you're not deeply engaged. It's a kind of piece of fluff. And because there are no great character and plot kind of structures that pull you deeply in. So you think about this film, and then you think about people you know, and you think about experiences you've had. And this process of watching this film is a much more interactive experience than many stories. You're not lost in the story. You're kind of pulled away slightly, and you're thinking, oh, well, this has happened to me, and I know that friend, this is, and you're kind of exploring love, the concept of it, both in your own life and on the screen as you're watching it.
I mean, my partner and I watch it every Christmas and have probably like 5 or 6 years, and she was doing it before me, and it works like fucking magic cinematic voodoo, right? I always cry, even though I've seen this film so many times, but it is because of that. We are and this is the interactivity. We're choosing to watch it at a particular time of year where you're reflective. The film allows you to be self-reflective in your own lives and then feel the warmth of the different forms of love within your life.
In The Exterminating Angel, Buñuel writes that film and makes that film for a very particular reason, which is nothing to do with the characters and the plot and the story. Love Actually is written for a particular reason, which is nothing to do primarily with the characters, plot, and story. Yeah. It's to make you think about love. It's to, as it were, to make the audience think about love. Buñuel is doing it to make you think about something else. But when you do this kind of thematic structuring, where actually you're taking away plot and character, the theme is much more important. It's about making the audience think about something. And that's what's really interesting about this. It's not, I wouldn't restrict it to political filmmaking, but it's a filmmaking that a writer, or a storytelling that a writer uses when they have something strong to say. So and as I say, the primary intention is not really to entertain, even though Curtis is a great entertainer too, and he's taking care of that as well. He's actually more interested in something else, which is what is not these characters' experience. What is our experience of love, and how can I provoke us into thinking about that by showing you a number of stories about love?
He very deliberately, from a pacing and craft perspective, does not give us many moments to actively sit back and dwell in that thematic question, because it's so tightly plotted. The fact that it is superficial and you're bouncing from story to story means that you are constantly kept somewhat at a remove from the story deliberately, so that you are engaging thematically with the story. But the only moments where you are completely in a thematic sequence from a craft perspective is those bookends where they're showing footage from people hugging each other at Heathrow Airport. And at the very beginning, you've got no context for it other than the voiceover, but at the very end of the movie, there's no voiceover, there's just music, and all those character and plot questions have been resolved, and you're just sitting there. And that sequence, you're watching that. And obviously the music and seeing images of love.
And lots of different images. It allows you to relate it to yourself.
Absolutely. But that is the only point, I think, as a filmmaker, where he's like, you as an audience member, sit back and think about love, rather than thinking about plot questions or character questions. It's all done. It's just like, now sit back and dwell on the experience that I've just taken you on and how that relates to you.
In the same way that a story can be heavily plotted or lightly plotted and whatever, when you're doing thematic structure, it could be heavily thematic or it could be lightly thematic. I think Curtis is a good commercial filmmaker too. There are commercial imperatives. You've got to keep the audience locked on. Buñuel has, is working from a different place. He doesn't mind if half the audience walk out. Curtis would regard that
like our audience.
Curtis would regard that as a failure. Okay, so he's looking to find that. So it's at the lighter end, but absolutely. What's interesting about both stories is that when you have an overarching thematic structure, you have to still have this problem of keeping the audience engaged. And so at a micro level, you still play very powerful games of character and plot. Because how you pull the question in when you don't have an overarching as a plot question or character question is, how do I keep the audience in? How do I keep them watching? Yeah. And the answer in both areas, both films, is you keep them in the moment. The question, what's happening next in the next 15 seconds, is very alive in Buñuel throughout, just like it is in Love Actually. The question of how does all this make any sense in a broader context? In Love Actually, it's quite sweet and simple. In Exterminating Angel, because there aren't other places to go to, because he hasn't given you other storylines and other characters to get to know, you're left with these characters, and very quickly you ask the question, what's going on? How do I make any sense of this? Yeah. And if you give up, you give up. Whereas with Love Actually, you go, what's going on? As soon as you go, how do I make sense of this? You're in another storyline, and you just have to keep watching in order to make sense of everything. So he kind of pulls you through to the end without you kind of going, this doesn't really have any proper structure. You don't re-ask that question, and at the end he's going to got you, and he goes, and it's a very clever, good piece of commercial writing thematically. Buñuel isn't, as I say, is much more of a purist, and he's not using multiple storylines because, and if you think about Magnolia, which is halfway between the two, Magnolia has 3 or 4 or 5 storylines, not as many as Love Actually, so it's not as busy. Those storylines are longer, so you have more time with the characters. There's more character depth, and there's more kind of complexity of plot in each of the stories. But because it's slightly more time, you then start to ask the question in a way that Love Actually doesn't allow you to so much. Why am I seeing these different stories? Why are we not just with one? What's going on here?
Like during the film, there are
go,
moments where you can sit back. I mean, in the most classic way in Magnolia is when they all stop and start singing.
Yeah, which is the Amy Mann, which is, as it were, a thematic sequence, which is, they all stop singing, and then what they start singing is not going to stop until you wise up, which is what the theme of the story is, that's what it's all about. That, what is it really about, the theme? It's that, you have to face up, one must face up to the things that make you who you are before you have any possibility of change.
We talk about it as bookending, but I think in contrast to The Exterminating Angel, it's not that the first question of Love Actually is not a plot question. It's not a character question. It's a thematic question. So it means the story is framed, and it does the multi-protagonist structure or multi-storyline structure to allow it. But the opening voiceover starts with a thematic question. Whereas to look at, just picking one because it's on my mind because of the antagonist series, All Is Lost is what happened to this guy. It opens with plot questions, a lot of them, or Shame opens with a character question. Love Actually opens with a thematic question. And then the middle of it may be more plotted, but it's still by choosing, I guess that's
by the middle, you're saying like 99% of the movie.
To an extent, yes. I'm just saying like it's an interesting, because I think Apocalypse
absolutely.
Now actually opens with a thematic question, but I'm not sure Exterminating Angel does. And so maybe we should move on to Exterminating Angel, which sounds like a Terminator remake, but it is not.
I mean, maybe for those people who don't know Luis Buñuel, maybe a little bit of context. Buñuel is a Spaniard, born in Zaragoza, which is the northern part of Spain. He grew up at the beginning of the century, and he fled Spain. Well, he fled Spain during the Spanish Civil War and stayed out of Spain during the Second World War, and in fact couldn't come back for quite a long time. The reason he couldn't come back quite a long time is because he would have been executed. His best friend at university were 2 best friends. One was Gabriel Garcia Lorca, the great playwright, and the other is Salvador Dali, the painter. And Lorca was executed during the Spanish Civil War. Buñuel made a film called Chien Andalou, a very famous film co-written with Salvador Dali, a surrealist masterpiece. And the important thing to understand about Buñuel, I think, is summed up in what happened when he showed the film in Paris, which is that he cut the bottom of the pocket of his trousers off and extended his pockets. So his pockets kind of went down to just below his knee, and he filled his pockets with rocks because he was expecting the audience, when they saw his film, to riot and attack him. Now,
for Chien Andalou.
Yeah, for Chien Andalou. This was a time when art could do this kind of provocation, where people were murdered, killed,
Sounds like Star Wars fans. And what's happening with your new Star Wars films?
For being the wrong kind of artist or making the wrong kind of film. But the point was, it wasn't that he thought, I've made a film, what happens if I don't like it? He deliberately made a film in order to provoke people, because he was a surrealist at that point, and surrealism was, and fundamentally was, at that time, a revolutionary movement. It was about changing things. It wasn't about, art, and it was actually using art to change society. People kind of lose sight of that. So this is the kind of guy we're talking about. He's You know, he's an anarchist and a revolutionary artist, and he's making films that are not about entertaining the audience. Okay. This is the story.
He's not trying to make money from
not trying to make money, and he's not trying. You know, he can. He's a beautiful entertainer. He made many very conventional films. He had a very successful career making films in the Spanish and Mexican industry, completely conventional films as a director. But when he made the films he wanted to make, he was very different. The last film he made was called That Obscure Object of Desire, and he was working with Carole Bouquet, the French actress, and he didn't get on with her. And they were shooting the film, and she wouldn't do stuff he wanted her to do, and she wouldn't work the hours he wanted him to work, and so he cast another actress in the same role. And so he has the same character played by two women.
I wanted to do a remake, Jenna Swat remake, with Jesse Plemons and Matt Damon playing that character.
So this is a guy who's very, very playful in the way that surrealists are. You know, if he's got a problem with an actor, he goes, okay, well, if I just give her half the work by casting another actress in the same part and then alternating when I shoot, then this gets over the problem of the actress not being very happy. And you know, his producer would say, yeah, but you've got an actor, you've got a character that from shot to shot changes physically from one woman to another.
Read into that.
And he goes, well, that doesn't matter. You know, that's the effect of that is interesting. You see what I mean? So this is the kind of filmmaker we're talking about. This is the story of Exterminating Angel. During a party at a mansion, which is set in Spain, the servants start leaving. There's a big dinner going to happen, and just before everyone gets back from a night at the opera or wherever they've been, the servants start to go. And at the time the guests would normally leave, they come and have dinner. They remove their jackets, they loosen their gowns, they settle down for the night in the house where they've been having this dinner. So they just don't go home. No explanation given. They just don't. Next morning, for some inexplicable reason, they're unable to leave. They simply can't leave the room they're in. And there's like an archway in the room that leads to the exit, and they cannot go past the archway. No explanation given. Days pass in this situation, and they become thirsty and hungry and quarrelsome and hostile and hysterical. One of the guests, an old man, dies. And so they stuff his body in a large cupboard and stuff curtain around the edge of the cupboard so the stink of his decaying corpse doesn't get too horrible. Similarly, there's a Ming vase in another cupboard, which is where they defecate and where they piss, because, you know, it's a good, sensible question. If they're stuck in the room and there's no toilet, where do they go to the toilet? He will answer that question. It's a plot question. How do they go to the toilet? Answer, they go in the Ming vase. The Ming vase is in a cupboard, which is set to one side.
I like that it's a Ming vase, specifically.
Eventually, the guests break a wall open to get to a water pipe. And then several sheep and a bear find their way into the room. So they walk through the room.
It's not as absurdist as it sounds. Like
they were cleverly set up.
They were cleverly set up earlier. They slaughter the sheep, roast them on a fire, okay, because, you know, they've got to eat. Someone suggests...
furniture.
Yeah, by burning furniture. Someone amongst their guests suggests the host is responsible and he must be sacrificed. So it all looks like it's going to turn very nasty. And then one of the other guests sees at that moment that they're all seated in the very same positions as they were just before this whole situation began, where they couldn't get out of the room. And so she says, what if we all sit in the same position again? What might happen? And they do that, and they find they're free to leave. So the problem, we can't leave the room, is now over. They all are free to leave. Outside, the guests are greeted by local police and servants, all have been outside waiting to see what's happening, who themselves couldn't go in to find these people. So to give thanks for the salvation, the guests go to church and attend a service at the cathedral. When the service is over, though, the churchgoers, along with the priests inside, find they are trapped in the cathedral and they can't leave. And the situation in the church is then followed by a riot in the streets. The military then step in to clamp down, and they fire on the rioters. And the very last thing we see, and the last scene we see, is a flock of sheep going into the church, accompanied by the sound of gunshots. And that's the end of the film.
But what does it all mean, Stephen? What does it all mean?
The great thing about it, well, I don't know, I love the film myself personally. I think it's terrific. It's entertaining nearly all the way through. It's such an absurd and strange story, and yet I find it quite engrossing. Moment by moment, you're kind of pulled into it.
I was going to say the way that it is actually very similar to Love Actually is that throughout the whole thing, there are tons of mini plot and character questions. If you paused it at any point and said, what is the plot question? It's the same plot question throughout the whole thing. Will these people ever be able to leave this room? Right? And there's no kind of character arcs or protagonist, but in any given moment, there are very particular plot and character questions posed. It's micro-plotted to within an nth degree. And my favorite example from all of these is the most kind of hysterical character in there is this woman who's constantly being looked after by the rest of the group. And there's a point where she, from starvation or just the psychological pressure of this situation, has a hallucination of the dead character you've mentioned. His severed hand comes out of the cupboard and there's an Evil Dead sequence. So like there are, in any given moment, Buñuel is working very hard to keep you engaged, even though there is no overarching plot or character questions.
I mean, I think that's the point, is that if you look at Love Actually, this film, I think these films there's nothing, but actually they're very, very similar. There are a large number of characters. Each of those characters in Exterminating Angel has a little tiny story of their own, and you go back to that story and those stories kind of unfold. So that it's you could argue that essentially, rather than sort of, it's basically, if you put all the Love Actually characters in a warehouse, in the same space, and you said you aren't allowed to leave, what you get is a kind of Richard Curtis version of The Exterminating Angel. They'd all play out their little stories in an enclosed space they weren't allowed to get out of. But
sounds kind of genius to me.
So you can see that. I mean, the reason it's similar is because the writers are wrestling with the same problem, which is they both want to get these kind of thematic questions out. And when you take away the overarching questions, the questions about Exterminating Angel, which are simple: who's the protagonist? There isn't a protagonist. The characters, which I love about it, they don't try and get out of the room. They try and get out once, and they realise they can't. Not one character in this film says, why can't we go out of the room?
They just accept
Not one character goes, what if we try and go out the window? What one character goes, what if we picked up something? Like, I know we can't physically go through the archway, but if I, for instance, picked up an ashtray and threw it out the archway, could that do it? So,
but they do throw things out of their archway.
In a sci-fi thriller, dinner party thriller version of this, Convergence or whatever, that would be the question, to be plot-driven, where they're like, how do we escape? And it becomes like interdimensional. Like, there's a Rick and Morty version of this, right, where it's all about how they try to escape.
When the audience watches a film like this, okay, the audience goes, why aren't they trying to escape? Why aren't they experimenting to see the boundaries of this? Why aren't they? And that's the question he wants you to ask. Then he goes, what Buñuel is going is, why don't you think they're on? What do you think the answer to that question is? Okay, so automatically, again, we're no longer asking the question, who are these people and what are they doing? The audience is asking the question, why don't they do that? And Buñuel is going, yes, why aren't they doing that? And then eventually the audience will get to the answer, because that's not what the story is about. And that's what Buñuel is interested in. Is now, as I said, he's quite happy for a bunch of people to go, they're not trying to get out, it makes no sense, they're making no effort, they're just stupid people, I don't like it, I'm going home to watch an episode of CSI, because that's much more sensible, I'll know where it's going. And so that's what they do. But Buñuel goes, okay, you guys go. Okay, but then the people that remain go, okay, well, I'm watching a story where the characters don't seem to be interested in anything logical and sensible. And then, so why does the story exist? What's it for? And then you come to another question, which is, who are these people and what is the story really about? And that, again, is a thematic question. If you go, well, I have to accept that it's not about will they find a way out? And the reason they find a way out at the end is an accident. And that woman who says, what if we do this, has at no point previously in the story made any effort to get out of the room.
Was she a Valkyrie?
Yeah, she's a Valkyrie woman. She's a strange foreigner, which is again not insignificant in the story. The reason she finds a way out is an accident. They, at no point in the story do the guests at any point through the middle of the story try and find a way out. They worry about their immediate needs. They worry about being hungry. They worry about, light. They worry about water. They worry about the way they look to each other. They worry still all the way through about social niceties. They worry about the order of things, like who should talk to whom.
Well,
and
some characters don't, and that's where
that again starts conflict and friction. So the question you ask is, why does this film exist at all? Now, once you get to that point, Buñuel is like, good. Here we go. This is what it's about. Now he's using, because that's a thematic question. And then you say, okay, so Buñuel has created a story which seems to go against all normal conventions of how a story should work. What can I understand about this? And you say, well, what I know is that he seems to be completely, he's not ignorant of narrative, because he's very skillful at using narrative at a micro level, but he's not interested in a conventional narrative. And then you go, okay, well, what that means is he's interested in more than telling a story. So what is it he's really interested in? And then you have to ask the question, what does this mean? And then you look at it, you stand back. And the effect, as it were, of not having strong character questions, not having strong plot questions, you stand back and you look at them. And you look at these characters, these people in this room, these people, and kind of like creatures in a zoo. They're kind of in a cage, and you feel slightly distant from them. You start to look at them as people in a cage, as specimens, if you like. And then you see, as soon as you do this, that essentially they're all members of the bourgeoisie. And then you get to the heart of what this film is really about. It's not that difficult it's quite clear really when you think about it. What he's saying is, this is the Spanish bourgeoisie. He made the film in Mexico because he couldn't make it in Spain because he would have been imprisoned by the government, and maybe like his friend Lorca, he would have been executed. What he's saying is these people are so obsessed with the minutiae of their lives and the social order of things, the structure of things, they don't understand or even question the outside world. They don't understand they have their own world, and anything outside that world is completely ignored. So, for example, I can't leave the room. They don't go, why can't I leave the room? Why is the world like it is? These people are incapable.
It's the way it is. This is the order of things. It's the natural order. This is natural.
So if they did ask the question, they might have to admit that the way they understand the world is not how the world is. And if they did that, their world would collapse. And so what he's saying is, this is the bourgeoisie. This is what the middle class, the unquestioning middle class of Spain, a fascist country, which is killing people who disagree with it. This is how they survive. They don't ask questions. They don't question the outside boundaries of their world, because if they did, their world would be gone forever, and they would have to change. And they would rather be comfortable in an enclosed space, shitting in Ming vases, than they would be to understand how the world is. It's a kind of attack on the bourgeoisie. And once you understand, it's quite clear. What he's asking you to do is think about the nature of the bourgeoisie. He's not interested in telling you a story about, that entertains with plot. What he's saying is, we, as political animals, need to think about the nature of the bourgeoisie because there is a coming revolution. And we have to understand that. So what he's doing is he said, whatever this film means is not in the film. It's outside of the film. And that's what I'm trying to make a film that tells the audience, if you want to know what this means, you have to come away from the film and think about things. And that's what thematic structuring is really for. Richard Curtis, in a much more different, sweeter way, is saying, come out of the characters and think about the nature of love. Here he's saying, think about the nature of bourgeois society. And also, because he's a surrealist, he thinks narrative is in itself a bourgeois construction. It's a construction, just like these people put a frame in their lives in order to give themselves a meaning so they don't have to look beyond. He thinks that narrative is the same thing. We have beginning, middle and ends. We don't have strange things happening. There is no illogic in the stories, because that makes us think that maybe the world is illogical.
And I mean, this is a tangent, but you've traveled the world dealing with story, and I have that experience. I remember reading The Writer's Journey, and Christopher Vogler's talking about the hero's journey is a very American ideal, and he's comparing it to Australian cinema. And it's like, well, our creation myths are very different. The hero's journey, the American ideal, American exceptionalism, traveling, building, forging a new life is very different to the Australian experience, where almost you've got the indigenous population, which was almost wiped out by a invader that was sending their prison population in chains here, and then successive waves of immigrants that were ultimately fleeing some kind of catastrophe. Like, understandably, our stories and our narrative structures are very different. And it's a question that I often have, is that idea of, I made a joke about The Last Jedi, I'm not sure if you've seen it, the recent Star Wars film, and there's a storyline that basically the heroes fail at the structural point you expect them to succeed. And people are like, oh, this is terrible storytelling. I don't understand why we follow that storyline when they contribute nothing to the cause. And it's like, in a Brunel film, that is the point. The point of that storyline is to make you question
what is this movie about?
What this movie is about, which is their belief that by being rebels, by being the rebellion or the resistance, would give them victory by default.
If you look at one of the great Australian movies, Picnic at Hanging Rock, again, at the centre of Picnic at Hanging Rock is the question, what happens, which the film has no interest in answering. These girls go up into the mountain and they don't come back. And all the characters in the film who are left are puzzling about what happened. The film never answers the question. And in fact, if you come out of that film saying what that film is really interested in is answering the question, what happened to those girls, you've completely misunderstood the film. The film is it's a thematic, which is about what happened to those girls. In some way, the landscape took them. Okay, which is a fantastic, as a poetic description of the history of Australia and the settled people, not the people who were here, but the people who came. In some way, the landscape took them. it's a thematic story. I mean, it's really, Picnic Hanging Rock is concerned with the question of exploring the nation of Australia, white identity in relation to the landscape, and the terror that white Australia feels for the landscape. That's kind of what that film is. And it's a thematic idea. It's not, there's a plot about, it has a plotted beginning. They go up the mountain, but they never come back. And the question of what happened is never really, it's not really what the film's about. Again, it's allowing, so when you watch Picnic Hanging Rock, what you get out of Picnic Hanging Rock is not a sense of a resolved plot or a sense of resolved characters. You get a sense of, there's a kind of sense of a mixture of awe and strangeness and kind of discomfort, slight anxiety. Then you watch that film, and that's kind of, and then you ask yourself, why do I feel like this? And then, the filmmaker has you, yes, why do you feel like that, Mr. Australian cinema goer, or Mrs. Australian white cinema goer, watching my film? Why do you feel discomfort and strangeness when you're confronted with the ineffable mystery of the Australian landscape? It's a thematic question.
And Wolf Creek asked the same question in a very different, horrifying way. But coming back to The Exterminating Angel, ostensibly this episode is on sequences, thematic sequences. There are phases in Exterminating Angel, right? There's them in the house and them in the cathedral and then the riot. But do you think there is distinct thematic sequences, or do you think the whole thing, aside from opening with this plot, it's not even, is it a plot question? It seems like a plot question. Why is this servant leaving? Why will he? And you assume that he's not even allowed back. The dialogue is you can't come back, but we assume it's because he's fired, not because what will be revealed is mystical. But it starts with what we think is a plot question. But is there distinct thematic sequences, or is it more that there is no? None of the sequences are asking plot or character questions, even if with the scenes themselves are plot driven.
Yeah, we need to be a bit technical. If you think of the beginning, middle, and end of a story, of a plotted story, like a thriller, for example, you'll have an overarching question you call the centromatic question, which is a plot question. Will the detective discover the killer, for example? And then you have the beginning question, the middle question, and then the final question. And you then say, okay, is the first question, the opening first act question, the second act and third act, are they as it were subsets of the overall question? So if you answer question opening, question middle, question end, you get the answer to the overall question. And then if you go down into for example, the middle act, you then say, okay, does the first sequence question of the first sequence of the middle act become part of the answer of the second act question? And in certain kinds of stories, the answer is yes. It's like a mechanism. They're all locked on a vertical and horizontal level. They all fade in. When you think of a thematic structure like The Exterminating Angel, there is no overarching question. There is a question: will they get out of the room? Which is the middle act question. It's a question in the middle act, but that question does not inform the overall question, and because there is no overall question. Similarly, the individual sequence questions, which don't exist, but there are individual scene questions, they do not inform the central middle act question: will they get out of the room? Nothing the characters do in the middle act contributes to them getting out of the room. None of the characters in the middle act are interested in getting out of the room.
I just want to clarify this, because it's one of the things I found most fascinating about the film is all these characters are caught in an absurdist, surreal situation. They cannot get out of this room, but they're all aware of it and they're talking about it. Like, I've got some lines of dialogue here highlighted. No one seems to behave logically, right? They're talking about it, but they're all aware that when they try to get out of the room that they can't. Now, where I completely agree with you is none of them then pursue on how do we get out of the room. That's not discussed, which is bizarre, but that's going to the point of the movie. But they are all...
Is it bizarre because of convention?
Maybe, but I think it's bizarre because it's how would I, as an audience member, act in that situation.
Another way of saying what you just said is that none of them say, what do we do? What's the plot?
Yeah.
What do we do? How do we behave?
Correct. And it stops becoming an objective of theirs because they just assume we can't get out of the room. What I find fascinating about the film is that they are all acting in a very grounded, relatable, normal way in this very absurd situation. And that's where a lot of the conflict comes from, is, these
How come that these people who seem like normal people don't do what normal people do? That's the question Buñuel is interested in you asking. How come these bourgeoisie seem like they're normal people, but when you put them in a situation when their action is necessary, they refuse to act, or they refuse even to contemplate the right, or what the right kind of action might be? And the answer is because they're bourgeoisie. Because if they did answer that, act in that way, they would find out things they might not want to find out that would not allow them to live in the way they like to live. You know, so and that's kind of what, again, it's thematic. Because why don't the bourgeoisie become revolutionaries? Is because if they become revolutionaries, they can't be bourgeoisie, and they're likely bourgeoisie because they're privileged. So he's kind of saying, why don't they question the boundaries of their world? It's a thematic question. You know, none of these characters are exploring this. None of these characters are asking the question. You come to this conclusion from watching the story. If you stick with it, you might walk out. But if you stick with it, you say, well, what's going on here? Why aren't these people asking any questions? Why aren't they doing anything? Why are they so complacent? And then you kind of go, okay, what is Buñuel doing? And this is the point. When you get this thematic kind of structuring, very quickly, if it works, you get the audience to the question, what is the filmmaker trying to do? And this is what I think is the most important thing about thematic structuring, is it takes the audience directly to that question, which is mostly when you watch a plot and character-driven story, you're lost in the story. And if it works, you know, you're completely compelled and you're pulled into the story and you're watching the characters and the plot. And you're not asking the question until maybe later when you're walking home, what kind of filmmaker is this? What kind of storyteller is, why, you know, what are they really interested in? You're lost in the story. In these kinds of stories, you're deliberately keeping the audience away from those kind of things. You're not interested in plot and character complexity very much. All you have to do is compel them to keep watching, which is the microstructuring that compels you to keep watching. And then, because you're not getting the bigger layers, you start asking those questions yourself, because the story isn't giving you those questions. What is the objective of these characters? You then ask a question, why are these characters not given an objective? And then you very quickly get the question, why is he doing this? Why is the filmmaker? Why am I watching this? What am I watching? And then you get to the question. So, assume the person making the story is intelligent and has something to say. Then what is it he's trying to tell me? And as soon as you get there, that's where you need to be. That's what thematic stuff is. And I think that's what, you know, what is the deeper idea that drives this story? You're actually essentially asking the question, what is the theme of this story? And if you had said, what is the theme of the Exterminating Angel? It is the complacent destructiveness of the bourgeoisie. Okay, that's what the film is really about. And watching this film, as you watch it, he's trying to make you ask that question. Whereas he's not interested in fundamentally entertaining you, or he is entertaining you in as much as the minimal amount of entertainment necessary to make you ask those questions. And in order to ask those questions, he has to take away, strip out the plot and character complexity, because if there was complexity, that was what you become interested in.
One of the things that sets this apart from Love Actually is, as you're saying, he's doing the bare minimum to keep you entertained in the moment. And because of that, because of the lack of any overarching questions, I think you're asking, what is this all about, continually throughout the film, at least from the first act kind of resolution. When they realize that they can't get out of the room, from then onwards, you are constantly asking that question because you're only being kept in moment to moment. So I've got some moments here. It does a lot of that heavy micro-plotting in actually the first act just to keep you in the film before you realize what the surrealist or absurdist problem is. There's two moments that I've highlighted. There's one moment where two men start doing hand gestures to each other, like some secret coded hand signals.
Like a Masonic
signals. Yeah, I'm assuming I read it as Masonic.
Yeah, and there is some reference to Masonic stuff later on. Yeah. Well, at one point someone goes to the archway that they can't get through and like starts screaming the Masonic call for help through it. And it's explained to you. But it's never returned to. And then the character that is actually like the savior of the whole film that gets them out, the Valkyrie character, early on in the film, she picks up a glass and throws it through the window. Yep. And at no point, like at that point, as an audience, you go, why did she throw that through the window? No one comments on it. No one...
No, they do go, what an interesting woman.
Yeah.
That was like... And then they like beeline straight for her.
And there's another point where a woman opens her purse and there's a dead bird inside, right? What it is doing in that first sequence is constantly just making you go, what the hell is going on, right? To make you lean forward, to make you engage intellectually with the movie, to keep you going. It then doesn't need to be quite so micro-plotted once you understand what the movie is about, because there's kind of other things that are compelling you and sustaining you. But it's working so hard. The difference between this and Love Actually is that there's no payoff to those questions, right? It is just asking those questions just to keep you engaged in the moment. And then once that you're engaged in the next moment, it doesn't care. Because as you say, Stephen, the point that Buñuel is trying to make is, I want you to ask questions about what this film is about, not who these characters are, what they want.
Imagine that you go to an exhibition of Dada art and you see, I think, Deschamps' furry urinal. You know that famous art piece where you go into thing and there's I think is it Deschamps or I think it's Deschamps or Deschamps.
The urinal.
Yeah, the urinal.
Urinal, yeah.
And it's furry.
Yeah.
Okay, so you go in, you see it, and you look at it. It's urinal, but it's not a urinal. It's urinal, but it isn't. So it's kind of it is something and it isn't something at the same time. And you look, and then you say, "Okay, what's that for? What's the artist doing?" And the artist is making you notice that it's something that is familiar, that is, but at the same time not familiar. And then he's hoping that you'll do something. I think about this thing and what it means. Yeah. Okay, this film is both a narrative story and not a narrative story. It plays all the games of narrative, has characters and situations, things happen, but that when they should be doing certain things like asking why is this happening, exploring, whatever, they don't do that. And the audience does exactly the same as you look at the urinal and they go, if they stay, they go, what am I supposed to make of this? And that's where he has you. And he goes, yeah, good question. Now, what's the answer? Now, that's not a question that a lot of films are interested in. They're interested in telling a story. This is thematic, where the filmmaker is saying, there is something I want you to think about. In order to make you think about it, I have to show you a story, but only to a certain extent. And then I have to take away the things you expect in a story to create a vacuum in which you can fill. Because if it's going to make any sense, you have to contribute. Because I'm not giving you everything. I'm going to create a vacuum in kind of technique, and then you'll go, what do I do about this? How do I understand it? What does it mean? What am I supposed to be thinking? What's going on? Who are these? And suddenly the viewer becomes much more active, it's much more of an interactive discussion and a kind of dialogue. And then you finally, if you want to stay with it, you go, I get it. The other thing to remember is this comes out of a storytelling tradition in Europe, and most of the most interesting thematic filmmakers come out of traditions where being explicit and open about what you think about the world is very often going to get you executed or imprisoned. So a lot of this kind of filmmaking, it's dealing in, it's not exactly, this isn't dealing in metaphor. These characters aren't metaphorical, they are the bourgeoisie. But it's a kind of storytelling of a kind where the audience is very familiar with the idea of what the thing is about is not on the surface. That you have to engage and think about it a little in order to work out what it's about. Now, when you're in a kind of free, inverted commas, artistic culture where you can say what you like, then sometimes these kinds of stories, when the artists want to say something, they just say it. This kind of filmmaking feels much more subversive, and it feels much more. It's interesting when I show this film to people. Some people are offended by it, in the sense they don't just not like it or they don't get it. They kind of feel offended. They're actively hostile to it, and that's really interesting because they're just, in some ways, they're not used to often seeing enough of this kind of work to understand that it comes from a particular kind of place, and they're not practiced in reading it. So they feel hostile because in some sense they think it makes them feel stupid. They understand that it's about something, but they have no idea what it is. Dylan said this line, something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? That's the feeling that some people watching this film get because they're not used to this kind of storytelling. They don't understand it, but they know it's doing something, but they don't know how to understand it.
And I think that's partly because of how tightly the sequences are structured in this. The metaphor I would use is what makes Salvador Dali and Rene Magritte, I can't say.
Magritte, yeah.
It's their combination of incredibly precise, realistic technique as painters with these absurdist images. You look at a Salvador Dali and you're like, this is almost photorealistic, but what the fuck am I looking at? Yeah. And it's the contradiction, the tension that makes you question it. Whereas I don't think you have that same, not that Jackson Pollock does not have technique, but it's not deliberately presenting itself as realistic painting. So you don't look at Jackson Pollock hunting for intellectual meaning in the same way that I think you do with Dali. Because what I'm trying to say is with Exterminating Angel is the technique, the precision of the narrative writing on a micro level allows you to, on some subconscious level, triggers this idea that this is meant to mean something and I can't work it out, therefore I'm offended. Either I'm chewing my meal for my meal or I'm not, but it's not being you know, a deconstructed, like, here's an egg and a piece of bread and a toaster and now you have to cook it for yourself. It's like there is combinations there. And to use an example that is a genre example, but I actually think Get Out, in the middle sequence when they're having, have you seen the middle sequence at the dinner party with the bingo and all that, it kind of, it seems a little bit more leisurely. And maybe it's a thematic character sequence. It's actually something, because at that point of the film, when he's going around talking to everyone, it's not a plot question.
Yeah, there's
until he's been told to get out, it's actually like, that's the time the film is saying, this is what the film is about.
Fairer skin has been in favor for the past, couple of hundreds of years. But now the pendulum is swung back. Black is in fashion.
Pardon me, I'm gonna take some pictures.
Yeah, very much.
Right? And it's almost like chosen to insert the thematic sequence at the beginning of the film. The thematic sequence isn't at the end anymore.
Well, not at the beginning, it's right in the middle.
It's in the middle.
Yeah.
The original ending of Get Out was him getting arrested and going to jail, right? And they changed that. And maybe that was almost, maybe that original denouement was meant to be the...
Denouement.
Yeah, whatever. I'm Australian. I meant to butcher words. That's where our accents come from, my drunk ancestors. You know, and now, but they didn't need that because it was in the middle. I mean, maybe that's common with a lot of horror films, is that the theme is actually more upfront or more central.
I think what you're putting your finger on is exactly what elevates Get Out, is that Jordan Peele had the wherewithal to say, I'm going to stop the plot, because they're essentially just having a garden party. What is the plot question? There is no plot question other than...
And what the fuck is going on?
And there's no sort of character question either, other than the broad, like, if you take it down right into the micro, what is it like to be a black person in a white upstate New York garden party?
That's almost a thematic character question.
Exactly. And it very much just takes the foot off all those pedals to make you go, what is this film
really about?
Yeah, and that's a really good point.
And that's what's great. It's kind of the takeaway. I hate that word, but the takeaway is that if you drop out the character and plot questions, the theme is going to come up.
Going back to one of our previous episodes and theses, we did an episode where we looked about where the protagonist was separate to the main character, where there were characters who were driving the plot of the story, and then there were characters who was really what the story was about. And we looked at Sicario, where the main character, the main perspective character of that film has very little influence on the plot of the film. It's really almost observational.
And it forces you to ask the question.
Exactly. And that's what I'm just realizing now, is that point where there's that whole sequence where the Benicio del Toro character, the film just leaves the plot and chooses a new protagonist and goes on a whole new sequence, and it's very tightly plotted. It's a thriller sequence where he's infiltrating by himself a head of a Mexican cartel to execute, spoilers, the head of the cartel and his family. But even though it's so tightly plotted and there's so much character questions there, the fact that sequence is chosen a whole new protagonist is forcing you to, as an audience member, to go, this is what the film is about. I've only just realized now that making that decision to change protagonist just for a sequence makes you go, this is what the film is about. It makes you pay attention to that sequence in a very different way to the way you've been engaging with the film previously.
Because you're undercutting, as it were, the primacy of the single protagonist, you mean? Yeah.
But I think maybe, and this is how I'm going to transition to Apocalypse, in the same way that there could be plot character, hybrid sequences, and I suggest that maybe Get Out is theme character. Maybe there's imagistic and thematic hybrid sequences, because that's what Apocalypse Now kind of feels like to me. It felt as much about the sensation as the intellectual aspect to it, which is different from Exterminating Angel, which to me wasn't an aesthetic or sensation experience.
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
an intellectual one. Yeah. But Apocalypse Now totally was like, fuck.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
I'd been a soldier since I was 19, and I still haven't learned how to wait for it. I wanted a mission for my sins. They gave me one. Nobody'd ever gone on a mission like it before. And when it was over, I'd never want another one.
Apocalypse Now, set in 1969 during the Vietnam War. So that's kind of the middle of the Vietnam War, is it, right? So the end is not in sight, but the war seeming to be going on for a long time. Its Special Forces Colonel Walter E. Kurtz has gone missing. We don't actually learn about that until kind of the inciting incident. Our point of view character is Captain Willard, who is basically, we open with him in an apartment going fucking crazy, Saigon, always Saigon, until he's pulled into a shower and then pulled in front of Han Solo and a bunch of army mates. Harrison Ford's in this in a very early role. And they tell him about this colonel whose methods have gone too far, even for the United States Army, right? And what's in Vietnam. And it's interesting because it keeps on cutting. You listen to this story about Kurtz basically saying we got to kill them all, to close-ups on the food that they're eating at lunch, the opulence, almost like Exterminating Angel, the bourgeoisie of the army at this point, eating this delicious food of prawns and all that, while they're basically giving Willard a mission. It's thriller territory. You need to go in deep into enemy territory, find General Kurtz, and kill him for us.
Your mission is to proceed up the Nung River in a Navy patrol boat. Pick up Colonel Kurtz's path at New Mung Ba. Follow it, learn what you can along the way. When you find the colonel, infiltrate his team by whatever means available, and terminate the colonel's command.
There's a specific sequence in Apocalypse Now, which is the point our attention to, which is the sequence where they're going upriver, and there's a moment where they get off and they crawl around the jungle and they get attacked by a tiger. They think the Viet Cong are in the jungle.
What is it? Charlie?
And it's a tiger. And there's quite a funny sequence where suddenly they realise it's a tiger. Oh, fucking hell, a tiger. And they run back to the boat, and they all dive in the boat, and the guy on the boat is like machine gunning the jungle because he thinks there's, Viet Cong there. And in fact, they're all terrified of a tiger, and they all jump in the boat and go, what was that? And it's a fucking tiger. And then they just like, the boat fires up and they zoom off. Okay, that's the end of that little. So then the question, if you like, of that previous sequence is, are there Viet Cong in the jungle? And the answer is no, there's a tiger. So that's a kind of plotted sequence. And they come around the bend. So you have a little section, and there's a bit more voiceover of him talking about Kurtz and...
Never get out of the boat. Absolutely goddamn right. Unless you were going all the way. Kurtz got off the boat. He split from the whole fucking program.
They come around a corner of the river, and suddenly there's a light and sound. That, for me, is the beginning of this sequence. And the sequence is they arrive, and it's basically an American base on the side of the river, and they get out, and it's a kind of mayhem. This
sure enough is a bizarre sight in the middle of this shit.
They go to supply depot, and there's hundreds of motorbikes, which are, of course, completely useless in the jungle. There's new motorbikes, still in their cellophane wrapping, that they're there, and this, stores seem to have everything, none of which is of any use, because the motorbikes in the jungle, there's no roads, they're in the middle of nowhere, and there's all this stuff, and one of the guys on the boat wants some petrol and
3 drums of diesel fuel, PBR5.
Come on, man, move. We don't have time. 1 hour, that's all. What do you want? Can I get us Panama Red with it? Panama Red? Yeah, I'll get you Panama Red.
Sergeant.
Destination.
I don't have no destination.
Without a destination. You got a destination?
Sergeant. Diesel fuel.
All right, you got a destination? I need a destination. I can't do a goddamn thing about it.
Hey, Sarge, these guys are with me. Destination's classified. I checked priority papers from ComSec Intelligence 2 Corps.
Okay, right, sir. Hey, listen, it's a real big night. $8 for that camo.
Hey! Damn. Just give him some fuel. You got it.
And the guy apologised, said, I'll give you guys tickets for the show. And he gives Willard a bottle of scotch. And then you kind of wander around, and then they go, there's a show, and they go to the show, and it's the Playboy Bunnies come down.
We're proud of you, because we know how tough and how hard it's been. Yeah! And to prove it, we're going to give you some entertainment we know you're going to like. Miss August, Miss Sangavani, Miss May, Miss Terry. Yeah! And the Playmate of the Year, Miss Carrie Foster! Yeah!
and there's a helicopter. It's very famous, and the Susie Q is playing on the thing, and the Playboy bunnies are dancing with rifles, and they're sexualizing the weapons. There's lots of, you know,
with the
phallic
cowboy and the
stuff,
pistols,
all that kind of stuff, and the pistols and everything. And the guys are all going crazy, and Willard is watching. And he's drinking his scotch, and he has no particular objective. And the guys have, you know, no particular. And then the kind of show degenerates, and then, you know, all the soldiers kind of mob it, and the Playboy bunnies jump on the thing, and then they all shoot off, and then the next thing you know, the boat's going back upriver, and they're back on the river again. So that sequence, for me, is a thematic sequence. What's the plot question? There is no plot question. You know, it's not will they get the fuel? That's answered immediately. There are, again, little micro questions. Will they watch the show?
But you know, the fuel is not an ongoing concern. At no point did you go, again, not Last Jedi, it's like, they're going to run out of fuel. How are they going to make it to the end? I just assumed they packed enough. And he's like, we need fuel. And I'm like, oh, okay.
So that section, then you say, okay, well, there's no plot question. When they stop at the river, they're not after. Willard doesn't want anything. They didn't even know it was there. They weren't headed to this place. They come around the corner of the bend, and there's a place. And so they go, let's get off. And they get off, and stuff happens, and they finish there, and they get back on, and they go again. And then you say, okay, what's that sequence for? Because it doesn't advance the plot. It doesn't unfold Willard's character. Actually, previously, we're having lots of voiceover about what he thinks about Kurtz and stuff. So that was much more about informing his character. It doesn't inform the character of the guys on the boat. They're just like nice guys who want to have a good time and don't want to die. And that's what they've been all the way through. And nothing in that sequence changes that. So there's lots of stuff going on, but none of it has any significance in terms of our story. Yet, we're pulled in because there's a show and there's music and, you know, things happen. It's a thematic sequence. Then you say, what's it for? Again, take away the character journey, which isn't there in that sequence. Take away the plot question. There isn't a plot question. What happens? You kind of watch it and you go, the American presence in Vietnam was insane. That's what you do. You watch it and you kind of go, I've played this
to
a group of
show.
Yeah, I've played this to a group of students upstairs, and just the sequence. Half of them hadn't seen the film. Okay, and I said to them, okay, what's this mean? And they just kind of went, it's just bonkers. It's just stupid. You know, it's just the whole thing is idiotic. And you go, yeah, that's kind of what it is. What he's making you think is this is the American story in Vietnam. You have too many resources, too much money, a huge military that is incredibly equipped, over-equipped, and what it's doing is pointless and futile.
And that is in stark contrast to Kurtz's speech about cutting off the arms of the kids that were inoculated against polio and the determination of Viet Cong. And it is the contrast.
Narrative is artifice. You basically construct a false world with reassuring lies. You know, and he's actually attacking narrative. That's what I think. You know, these kind of filmmakers are out there. He's just saying the world is not. If you think the world is simply understood, then you're making a basic mistake. And as an anarchist, I think the political point about that is if you distract yourself with narrative, meanwhile the world is being stolen from you, by those in power.
So we've talked about previously on episodes about worldview, the idea that there is the worldview which is inherent to the artist, right, or the writer. We've got a view of how the world works. Everyone has it, whether I think they're subconscious or not. There is a worldview that they create within the world, and then there's the worldview of the individual characters. And I think what is interesting about Exterminating Angel is you can view it through that lens, that there is a worldview of Brunel, the anarchist Brunel.
Bunwell.
Of Mr. B.
Mr. B, okay. Or Luis, call him Luis.
Luis.
Okay.
There is his worldview about the anarchist and the bourgeoisie. And there is their worldview of quite literally the world that they're in, and they act appropriately. And the theme for the audience is the conflict or the tension between those two things.
Yeah, I agree.
Right?
With that.
And so there is a possibility, and in Love Actually, there is a world view of that, which is life. There is something in that, which is life is meaningful and love is what gives life meaning.
Yeah.
Right? Or it can also be destructive, but it's an exploration of what love means within that. It's very small. And I'm going to come, and this again hooks us into Apocalypse Now, because I think there is the worldview of Francis Ford Coppola about what the war is. Kurtz's worldview is an absolute central motif in that film.
In a war, there are many moments for compassion and tender action. There are many moments for ruthless action. What is often called ruthless. What may in many circumstances be only clarity. Seeing clearly what there is to be done and doing it. Directly, quickly, awake.
And the worldview of all the other characters. Almost every little vignette, episodic moment is exploring not just a particular part of that world, but we get to meet characters and have moments where they explain exactly how they think Vietnam means.
Because there's a conflict in every human heart between the rational and the irrational, between good and evil. And good does not always triumph. Sometimes the dark side overcomes what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature.
And Vietnam at that point is because it's the only world we ever see, we never leave Vietnam. And so it kind of becomes a stand-in for the world at large.
Well, that's the only other point I wanted to make about Apocalypse Now. You know, we've got this very clear sequence. It is a thematic sequence because it's such a clear craft tool. I'm going to remove all the character questions, remove all the plot questions. It's going to prompt you to ask or realize or feel this is what the film is about. I think the structure overall of Apocalypse Now does also lend itself to this because it's so episodic in nature. I mean, it's setting up a plot question that will sustain through this episodic structure.
Yeah, which is you need to find Kurtz and you need to kill him. But the film chooses not, and then it's a series of vignettes down the river. Like the whole structure of the film is them going on this little...
It's a road movie.
Yeah, it is a fucking road movie.
No, it's interesting because, and again, you know, it does have a central dramatic question, which is a plotted question. Will Willard kill Captain Kurtz or Colonel Kurtz?
And he says that early on, which is, when I get there, I don't know what I'll work out what I'll do when I get there.
Yeah.
Right?
But the fact that it is a road movie, the fact that it is episodic in nature, allows it to take those sequences and decide, is this going to be a plot-driven sequence? Is this going to be a character-driven sequence? Is this going to be a thematic sequence? Its narrative structure sets the audience up and to be delivered a message, because it's not like each of those individual sequences, you could almost lift any of them out of the movie and you just wouldn't notice.
It's interesting too, if you think about interesting to talk about road movies, a very good point. You know, the point about a road movie, the deeper meaning of it thematically, you know, what's the thematic meaning of a road movie? Generally speaking, the journey is more important than the arrival. That's kind of what a road movie kind of says. It's what you learn on the journey that really matters, not so much getting to a destination. Getting to a destination resolves the story, but actually it's what you learn along the way. And those things that you learn are to agree sometimes to do with plot things that you must do. Then there are things that you must understand, and then there are deeper truths that you must acknowledge, i.e. plot, character and thematic sequences. You know, so it's no wonder in a film this intelligent that, you know, you're going to get a mixture of sequences which are dealing with the right way to behave, the right way to act, the right way to think and understand, and the right things to acknowledge to be true. And that's kind of what's going on the journey for Willard.
And I think what is interesting about this film, in comparison to both Love Actually and Exterminating Angel, is the film has sequences that are heavily plotted, and then has sequences that are more character, and there are sequences that are more thematic.
Yeah.
Right? So it opens with something that's thematic. It's got the incredible kind of montage of the explosions and the voiceover.
When I was here, I wanted to be there. When I was there, all I could think of was getting back into the jungle.
And it's interesting that both Love Actually and Apocalypse Now open with voiceover. Terrence Malick does it as well. It's almost voiceover says, force you to consider from the very beginning, what does this all mean?
Yeah.
Really, most opening voiceovers are either sci-fi exposition or they're like, what does this all mean?
Yeah.
Fancy words. But as the film progresses, it becomes increasingly... it's almost surreal. The film captivates you, right? And I mentioned the imagistic, and this is a hard thing to articulate in the podcast, but the cinematography is so sensory. It's about the sound design, the choppers. It is as much a sensory experience as it is an intellectual one. There are moments like Kilgore's speech, which is a moment of this is what the film is about, right?
Smell that? You smell that? Napalm, son! Nothing else in the world smells like that! I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know, one time we had a hail bomb for 12 hours. When it was all over, I walked up. We didn't find one of them, not one stinking dink body. Smell! You know, that gasoline smell! The whole hill. Smelled like victory.
But there are so many little journeys along the way that it is episodic. It is a road movie. It is, we milk Kilgore, we have this action sequence, we go have the moment in the jungle and we find the playmates, and you see all the carnage along the shore banks and all the smoke, and it makes you just constantly reflect upon what you're seeing. And then they get to the arse end of the world.
Dolong Bridge was the last army outpost on the Nung River. Beyond it, there was only Kurtz.
That almost the reason I'm jumping to that is that feels the next plotted moment, doesn't it? Right, where it's like he goes to find the commanding officer. That's the plot question.
Captain, where you going?
See if I can find some fuel, get some information.
Take me up the other side of the bridge.
And then the plot question is well, it's answered in the sense that there is no commanding officer.
Did you find the CO, Captain?
There's no fucking CO here. Let's just get going.
Right? It's almost...
Nothing makes sense. There is no order.
There is no order here, right? And because it's answered in a way that we're not expected it to, that little sequence about the bridge and the comment about we build the bridge so Charlie can blow it up, and then we build it again so the generals can say the road is open. You know, it gives us a moment of reflection about what does this all mean, which is the futility of it all. That's, again, a thematic scene, but it's almost like the plot structure of it, which is find the commanding officer, allows it to become thematic because it's answered in a way that we don't expect. Because it's not like, oh, the commanding officer's dead.
Yeah.
Or here is the commanding officer. It's actually there just isn't one. There is no order.
Where I kind of want to draw some contrasts and comparisons is this isn't like Thin Red Line where the aesthetic and narrative structure of the movie is deliberately keeping the audience one step back to kind of question the theme of the movie. Like there are lots of sequences of Apocalypse Now where you are very firmly like in the sequence and there is an overarching plot question, which there isn't in Thin Red Line, for example. But the fact that it is so episodic, so vignetted, and that none of these sequences seem to be necessary to go into the next sequence. It's not like Willard is learning something that he needs to use in the next sequence, or that
it's not Benjamin. He's not finding the diamond that, oh, we're running out of fuel, we got to get the fuel, and we go to the fuel and we get the map, and then we go to that, and the commanding officer tells us it's constant refusal to answer that stuff. He needs the CO because he wants to find out what Kurtz is. So he just basically fucking stumbles onto him.
Yeah, but the structure of the movie is forcing an audience to go, what is this about?
Because there is, again, it's not incremental knowledge. He doesn't learn one thing and then move on to the next. It's more like spending time in that place makes you realise something. And it's really, like you say, every now and then you have, and I think it's very similar to what people say the war is like. You know, you have moments of intense activity where you're absolutely in the moment and you're kind of extremely excited, and all you're thinking about is for the next 3 seconds. And then there are moments where you're much more reflective, when nothing much is happening, and you look around, and the boat drifts upriver, and people are all very quiet, and you got the voiceover, and it's like, and the voiceover isn't telling you very much. It's more like meditations on the state of mind of Willard, meditations on Kurtz, but it's not kind of directing you very much. And again, once that plot of stuff falls away, once you come from where you come out of the Valkyrie attack and you come into a boat drifting upriver, you start thinking, what must it be like to be there? What must your mind starts drifting, and you're not actually even entirely in the film anymore. You're kind of watching yourself watch a film and thinking about the notion of war, etc. And again, that's completely deliberate. And you take away those kind of planks of narrative that push you forward into what happens next, what happens next, what happens next. Once that question becomes less urgent, you take away that question, and you take away to a degree the question of who are these people, because you're not really exploring that. Then you have to, the next question down is, what does it mean? And that's, that takes you to the theme. And again, And it's unlike Buñuel, who's making the whole story constructed around the notion of how do I get the audience to think about the theme. Here it's more episodic, like a road movie often is in many road movies, that part of the way of that journey is understanding what does it mean. You know, someone on a journey goes, how do I get to where I'm going? Who am I with? And if it's a long journey, you kind of go, who am I? What does, you know, you become reflective. And that's, you're just mimicking in some sense in the structure, you're mimicking the actual process of going on a long journey. You are thinking about the meaning of things. It's interesting if you think about this way of thinking about a story and you compare it, for example, to the notion of a hero's journey, which is an endlessly questing, driving, you know, where you're not allowed to think too much about who you are because you're on the quest, you know. And in fact, and so when you have a very tight journeying structure where you have heralds and, you know, all these kind of, you know, hoobly-glibs and gobbles and, you know, you have 27 different characters all have a different function. That means you can never be more than two minutes away from a function. So you can never actually think deeply about anything because you've got to think about the next function, which is what that stuff is about. It's about not thinking. That's about not allowing the characters to think too much. And this is what, you know, this American filmmaker is doing, is taking this, you know, hero's journey and basically not obeying any of the rules about how you do this kind of heroic journey. I'm sure there's somewhere on the internet a hero's journey analysis of Apocalypse Now, which shows how it fits every beat minutely, but he's not. He's basically saying things aren't straightforward. This Vietnam experience is not a straightforward thing. It doesn't have a simple meaning. You know, there wasn't a clear action at any point. There isn't one right thing to do. There are a number of possible things you could do, some of which are right, some of which are wrong, some of which are neither. And it's the whole, you know, if you want to tell that story, you can't have a simple narrative structure. You can't have a plot-driven structure because you won't be able to get the level of complexity of understanding. You have to have a plot, theme, character structure because you're exploring all of those things. So different sequences have to explore different areas. You must if you're looking for that kind of story.
I wonder if we're going to see an impact on televised storytelling in binge culture, because previously where you had... Because you're forced to wait a week. So the episode didn't feel the need to make you, at the end of that episode, to go into the next episode. That was not the driving force. Because in binge culture, the idea is like, we need to end an episode making you want to watch the next episode. Whereas this is like, yes, it does make you want to do that because it's about sustaining you across the week. But I think the overall driver is to make you reflect, what was that episode about?
You know, it's fascinating because, yeah, I watched Apocalypse Now and I watched the original cut. It's 2.5 hours. That is like a 4-part miniseries, right? Like it's like a BBC's like Collateral, which I watched earlier in the year. But I don't think if you put Apocalypse out now as a 4-part series, no one would probably fucking finish watching it. Right? The drop-off... Like, the fact that it's got a captivated audience is part of being so hypnotic. You are like the characters in Exterminating Angel. It's like, I could go to bed. But I'm here now, right?
This is why cinema's going to make a comeback. You know, at the moment, everything's about TV and TV and TV and TV drama. You know, when you have a lot of cinema, eventually you mine it out. You know, when you have one art form, when you have lots of male characters, you mine them out. The interesting thing, we talked about this before, the thing about female characters now is they're not male. Not just that they're female, which is interesting itself, but another really fascinating thing about female characters is they don't do what male characters do. And we're bored sick because all the writers in the world have done all the possible variations of all the reactions that male characters can do in any given situation. So what's happening with binge stuff now is that we have a new form because we hadn't had it for ages, and so suddenly we have the TV serial comes back, and suddenly the binge comes, and then we mine out, as we do in our culture. We tend to exhaust everything. And so then someone's going to go, you know, you can go to the cinema for 4 hours and watch a film. The kind of thing now that people go, you know, is it almost inconceivable you could do that these days? In 3 years, there will be a really successful 4-hour feature film.
Because I think a lot of this stuff is to do with pacing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there will often be, in highly plotted films, the decision to take the foot off the gas, to slow the pace down, just to orient the audience around what the film is trying to say, or ask character questions or what have you. And so in those circumstances, I imagine it's the pacing. It was not worth taking the foot off the pedal to ask a question that had already been answered. Whereas in the bedroom, I think it's a fascinating decision about how what is already a slow-paced film, about when they put their foot on and off the pedal. And when I'm talking about the pedal, I'm talking about plot questions, really.
Intensity coming from... But it is an intensity thing, right? There is an intensity and we brought it up at the beginning, and I think we'll go into it, because neither Exterminating Angel or Apocalypse Now have any intensity from dialogue. They don't get dialogue intensity like in Naked. Do you think?
I wouldn't agree with that. I think in Exterminating Angel, it's a very I mean, first of all, the dialogue is quite lively, but what's really interesting about it is how quickly, basically, it's like a drawing room drama. It's very theatrical. You have characters. The way that it works for a big section of the opening is characters walk down to front of stage, talk together for 2 or 3 lines, then they walk backstage and another character walks forward and does it, and that goes on and on and on. So whilst the individual dialogue lines may not be themselves really exciting, you have very dynamic movement of characters across the stage. Literally, it's like one character comes to front of stage, says something to someone else, then he walks off and she comes in, then he walks off and she comes in and she comes in, and and it's backwards and forwards, and you're following like 5 or 6 separate conversations which you see extracts of, and then they go backstage and they're carrying on, but you come back into those conversations. So it's not so much that the dialogue itself is sparky like in Naked, but you've basically got 7 or 8 lines of dialogue going over like a 15 or 20 minute period, and it's very active and dynamic in the way that's done.
All right, and Love Actually has an intensity by intercutting so many stories, right? And you're keeping track of them. And I would argue that Apocalypse Now has kind of like, for a lot of it, a sensory intensity, like the imagery and the sound and the music, right? But what I think is so stunning about the third act, which I'm still trying to...
Sorry, just to come in on that sense of imagery, going back to Tarkovsky, we say that what Tarkovsky was saying in the quote we talked about was that there is in some sense a meaning that's beyond, as well, logic and intellect and understanding. And I think that imagery is in Apocalypse Now does exactly the same thing. We talk about how the jungle looks, and the sense of that is that it's kind of putting characters against a background that they don't understand, and we don't understand what the image system means, but we understand the film kind of shows you a kind of a world where there's a meaning beyond our understanding, and we're very aware that these characters are kind of against that background that we don't fully understand, and neither do they. And I think that's very deliberate, and it is in some sense the imagistic logic of Apocalypse Now does relate to the way that Tarkovsky would have thought about imagistic logic.
Where I'm getting to is that it seems to, I mean, it's got incredibly powerful imagery, and the third act it's pretty fresh, and I'm still processing it. But it seems like there is a thematic intensity into it. Like it's actually, the intensity is all about, what is this about? They find Kurtz. He just goes and talks to Kurtz, right? And pretty much Kurtz works out straight away, he's there to kill him.
It smelled like slow death in there. Malaria. Nightmares. This was the end of the river, all right.
It's not about the politicking. It's not Game of Thronesing that sequence, right?
But it is conflict between 2 worldviews. Because what Willard... I mean, like I said, you've seen it yesterday, I've seen it 10 years ago. But one of the few things that sticks with me is Kurtz's monologue.
But you have no right to call me a murderer. You have a right to kill me. You have a right to do that. But you have no right to judge me. It's impossible through words to describe what is necessary to those who do not know what horror means. Horror. Horror has a face, and you must make a friend of horror. Horror and moral terror are your friends. If they are not, then they are enemies to be feared. They are truly enemies.
But you get very much what Kurtz's point of view is. Kurtz almost feels resigned to the fact that he's going to be assassinated by Willard. Yeah.
Well, and that's part of the idea, is he wants it.
But he's offering Willard his point of view. So he's kind of offering Willard with a dramatic choice to either accept my point of view or continue with the worldview that you came here with in terms of your mission and what you're representing. And so it does feel hugely thematic.
I worry that my son might not
understand what I've tried to be. And if I were to be killed in Willard, I would want someone to go to my home and tell my son everything. Everything I did, everything you saw, because there's nothing that I detest more than the stench of lies.
The third sequence is almost purely theme. The plot question of will he kill him or will he not
I would say that there is a live plot question that is all the way through, which is will he kill him, which is only answered in when he does. And I think there's a live plot question which is will Willard understand who Kurtz really is and how he came to be like this? And I think that is a plot question. But I think both those things are done in a very leisurely way, and we don't race to either of those things. And I think it's quite clear that Kurtz, now you say, knows that what he's there to do and is accepting of it, and knows it will happen. And because those questions again are very lazily explored in some sense, not lazily in a pejorative sense, that's as it were the way that the filmmaker has chosen to do it. Because we're not racing through again, it's like those cracks then start to appear, and out of that the theme comes up. So I wouldn't say it's thematic in a technical sense. It's not driven by a thematic question. I think the plot and character questions are still alive, but I do think because they're so slow and they're so leisurely, that what that allows is the theme. It's not a story that is, or not a way of storytelling that's afraid to slow things right down. So again, the audience doesn't have to race to work out what's going on. There's no point in which you go, how do I understand this? It's quite clear all the way through, and it's quite clear in character terms what's going on. So it gives you the space to think, okay, we go one level down. Now that we know what's going on, we know who these people are, we understand how they're evolving slowly, then we can ask the deeper questions about what's this really about. Given that we've seen so much thematic stuff before, which has been structured thematically, then I think we are now reading the world in a kind of very complex way, because the way the story has been told to us allows us to understand. We've been looking at the story thematically because it's been given to us that way, and in character and in plot. So now by the time we get to the end, if we're in it in a very sophisticated way. And again, it's about, he's taught the viewer, as it were, the viewer of the film, to ask the question, what is the deeper meaning here? The way that he's told the story has made that question live and legitimate frequently. So by the time you come to the end, the audience is asking, what's happening, who is it happening to, and what's the deeper meaning here? In a way that a faster-paced story wouldn't allow that kind of reading of the story to happen.
And the intercutting of the ritual slaughter of the cow with the killing of Kurtz, the juxtaposition forces you to ask the question of, why am I being shown this? What is the meaning behind this?
I mean, that's like in Don't Look Now, like that hugely famous sequence where you're intercutting the couple having sex with them getting ready to go out. Yeah. The fact that is being juxtaposed forces you to ask, why are these being juxtaposed? What does this mean? I mean, obviously this is a lot going to editorial and directorial skills in
but you can write
film storytelling. You can write that on the page as well.
I'd say Alan Scott, who wrote that film, if you read his other scripts, it's not actually, you don't think, oh God, they did that in the edit suite. I'm sure they did a lot of it, but if you read Alan Scott's scripts in other films.
I'm sure they did the specifics of it in the edit suite, but the idea probably came from the writing.
But in terms of, this is kind of links it to pacing in a way, like when you're asking less plot questions, you're slowing down the intensity, the pace of the film. It's forcing, as you say, a vacuum that is bringing in audience questions.
Yeah, I think the intensity might come from, that feeling of intensity comes from how intensely you're pulled into the story. You don't mistake, as with the intensity of the storytelling, from the fact that if you are now, he's got you, the filmmaker's got you, you're asking these deeper questions, you are doing exactly what he wants you to do, which is to say, oh, how do I understand this? What's it got to do with me? What's it got to do with, my understanding of the way the world works? What's it got to do with the American intervention in Vietnam? What does it all mean? Okay, which is not a question you normally, you read a script in a development meeting and someone says, when I got to this point in the script, I started asking, what does it all mean? That's a criticism. That's like, what, wasn't it clear? You were actively asking, what does it mean? Oh dear, we have to rewrite this section. But here, it's actually, that's where he wants you. And the intensity you feel at the end is because now, unlike most stories where you've got plot and character, as it were, banging away at high volume, you've also got theme working at high intensity. And so you get this sense of texture and complexity that you've got to work really hard to balance all these different things in your mind, the characters, the plot, and the deeper meanings and the resonances and the image system, which is still at play, of course, all the way through, and the sensory overload of it all. And it feels like a really intense experience at the end of the story, which is exactly where and you're struggling, as it were, to maintain your equilibrium in the face of all this information and asking deep questions, and you come out and it's like one of those films. You walk out, if it worked for you, you walk out of the cinema, you went to the street, you can't talk for 5 minutes.
They were gonna make me a major for this, and I wasn't even in their fucking army anymore. Everybody wanted me to do it. Him most of all. I felt like he was up there, waiting for me to take the pain away. He just wanted to go out like a soldier, standing up, not like some poor, wasted, rag-assed renegade. Even the jungle wanted him dead, and that's who he really took his orders from anyway.
And coming back to this idea, my little observation about endings, it gives you, after he's killed Kurtz, music and sound, character is the plot question is resolved, the character question is resolved, and he walks out holding Kurtz's writings out covered in blood, and they all bow to him. And again, it's forcing you to ask the question, what does this all mean? And it just gives you that moment at the end of the story. It may seem like a slight thing and an obvious thing, but it's something that in almost all almost whatever genre you can write, you can give the audience, find ways of giving the audience those moments of reflectivity in terms of theme, And coming back to the reading thing, it's just an anecdote, but apparently there's a couple different versions of the end credits, and there was a version on Laserdisc where they had just explosions over the end credits, right? And people were assuming that the airstrike actually happened, that the airstrike that his mate tries to call in actually happened, that they're still generating and looking for meaning. So instead of just this cool, basically B-roll footage he had of explosions that he was using as texture behind the end credits, they were interpreting on a thematic, on a narrative level. Right? And he ended up, now it's just black, because it's I want the film is over, no more. He wants
or dwell on the film. Don't
dwell on,
try more meaning
into it. Which is just an interesting thing about how audiences are actually, they're that weird balance between sometimes you're they're hungry and we need to feed them. You don't want to spoon, that whole dance you have with the audience is so complex as a
But it shows,
writer.
how what the audience wants always is to hunt for me, is to hunt for as well plot. They always go for the easy answer first. Yeah. What does it mean? What's happening? What's happening?
Yeah, they go for plot. And so the airstrike actually happened. They bombed the shit out of Kurtz.
In order to get the audience to think, you have to take that away. That's the point. That's what Buñuel is saying. That's what these filmmakers are all understanding. You take that away, nothing is, the meaning of the action doesn't mean anything. Who the characters are doesn't mean. Once you take that stuff away, then the audience is okay. So what is it really about? And that you have to. What we're saying, it's a constructed moment. With the thematic thinking, you've got to take this stuff away in order to allow the audience to go deeper. If you keep everything, the plot and the character on the surface, the audience doesn't have to go deeper to enjoy the story.
And in a way, it highlights the film that by refusing to really answer plot questions, the film forces you to go to thematics, because he speaks to Bass, and he's been instructed to do the airstrike, but then his head's cut off, and it's that plot line is fucking dead, but it's not. It's abandoned, deliberately abandoned, because it's not about whether or not they're going to napalm Kurtz's, quote unquote army. Should we move on to In the Bedroom?
I was just thinking.
About what?
About you.
Where are they, with him?
It's none of your business.
They're my boys, but they're none of my business.
Oh my God, what happened?
Come on, tell me you hit him.
You take my house, and you take my kids.
Go upstairs.
Stay here. No!
You can't admit the truth to me or to yourself. You encouraged him.
Are you saying that I'm the one responsible? I know what you think, that I let him get away with
everything!
In the Bedroom is set, I also think, like Manchester by the Sea, a kind of small New England, like definitely East Coast, Maine. Okay, Maine fishing town. It's about a family, like two middle class, a doctor and a singing teacher at a local high school, and their college age son. That's the story revolves around them. He is dating a woman who's separated from her husband, who has two small children. She is separated from her husband because he is abusive. It becomes important to the plot that he's kind of like, it's not aristocracy, but he's the son of the canning plant in the town. So he's got the most power and resources and economics and all that kind of stuff. The son of this couple ends up getting murdered by the abusive ex-husband.
Killed. It's important that he's killed. We don't know whether it's manslaughter or murder.
Not to the audience.
We never see it. We never actually see what happens.
And then I heard the shot. Richard.
I'm sorry. Richard. Could we go back just a minute? Mrs. Strout, you said you heard the shot.
Yes.
You heard the shot. Did you actually witness the accident?
Objection. Your Honor, there are no grounds to indicate this was an accident.
Sustained. Strike the word accident from the record. Rephrase your question, Ms. Keyes.
You're confident you can put him away for good then, right?
The things she said in there. What's the damage?
The way this is going, potentially manslaughter.
Jesus Christ! He killed our son! It was no accident!
Ruth. How long will he be sent away for?
Well, that's hard to say, really. Anywhere from 5 to 15 years, but we're confident that we'll get the maximum. So even with good behavior, he'll do 10 full
years? Are you out of your mind?
Dr. Fowler, Mrs. Fowler, I'm sorry. I understand.
No, you don't.
It's only at the point of the son's death that you really get an idea that the film is about the parents, because it's finally where the film chooses a selective point of view of experiencing the parents' grief, and it then stays with the parents for an awfully long time. I've got the timings here. The son is only killed. This was a fascinating experience for me because I watched the film.
Have you not seen it before?
I had. I saw it on theatrical release. Really enjoyed it. But this is the first time I've revisited watching it, and I'm watching it through this lens, and I didn't realize that the son only dies 40 minutes into the film.
Yeah, it's the first act.
40 minutes is a long
It's a long first act. But it is a long
thought it
first
was
act.
much, from my memory of the film, I thought it was much earlier. Because the film then spends a good hour after that just dealing with the parents' grief, right? All it is really about is, will these two people ever recover from their grief? And then the final 20 minutes of the film is this very kind of taut thriller sequence where the father kidnaps the killer, kidnaps Richard Strout, ends up murdering him, burying him out in the woods, and coming back to his wife. And
Who
we're
then
gonna
offers to make him breakfast.
Oh,
you must be so hungry.
And we're going to talk about this. So I'm going to let Stephen introduce this, and I'm going to reserve my right for rebuttal.
Well, I'm going to say what is interesting about this film, and it's sequence related, but not necessarily thematic. This film has got three different kind of genre structures. It opens almost like a rom-com. Not a rom-com, but a romance. Like it could be a Nicholas Sparks romance.
Yeah.
And there are people that I know reading reviews that thought that's what they were going to be watching, right? Because it's like in the bedroom, and it's like Marissa Tomei and Nick Stahl, and it's like this couple, and it's about like them and him learning to love her children, and the parents not approving of it, and the abusive boyfriend, and you think maybe that's, and it's structurally set up that way, and then boom, and then the rug's pulled out of you, and you're like, oh fuck, who we thought was the main character is not the main character.
Well, exactly what you're saying. The first act of the film is fascinating because it spends kind of equal time with Marissa Tomei, with Nick Stahl separately to Marissa Tomei, but with her, then to each of the parents, Tom Wilkinson and Sissy Spacek, and them together, and then them as a group of all four of them together. So you're not got a clear idea of whose story this is until 40 minutes into the film.
And then we realise it's the parents, but it's still spending equal time with Sissy Spacek and
Tom Wilkinson.
Tom Wilkinson.
Yeah.
Ruth and Matt. But then Matt begins to emerge as the central character for the thriller sequence at the end, which is the third phase of the film. My point
But it's
is,
very limited in comparison. You know, you've done an hour and 40 minutes before you get to that talk.
Absolutely. I'm just saying these are the three phases of the story. What is interesting is in juxtaposing in such a way, bringing out a theme that has emerged over this episode, is the juxtaposition in itself forces us to ask the question of, why am I watching this? And I know that there are people, having read through a bunch of like letterbox reviews, as I do after this, where there are people like, this felt really episodic and disjointed and I didn't like it. And there are other people that are like, this film is amazing and I love that it started off as a romance and ends in a thriller. And so in a way, in the same way like Exterminating Angel, it chose to be divisive because some people did not. And it's fine. It just doesn't work for them that they sit there and go, this is not the film I thought it was going to be. The promise of it being a Nicholas Sparks romance.
But if you ask the question, the thematic question, what is that story really about? Under the surface, what is it really saying?
To me, how
would you answer?
You see, what I interpret the end of the film about, it's actually about the marriage between Matt and Ruth. Right? I actually think that is what the film is essentially concerned with in the different phases of their life. Because in the beginning, it's about them, even as much as we see it between Frank and Natalie, their relationship, we do have moments we spend with them talking about their son, what they want for his future, whether he will be with Maria, you know, he should end it, he's got to go, he wants to do and study architecture, Ivy League education. It's about their love for him. And then that future's taken away. And then it's about them overcoming grief. And they don't talk to each other. The whole second act is this incredible pot boiler where they don't talk to each other about what happens. And then it blows up in this amazing climactic scene where they argue with each other and hurt each other.
What do you want?
I want to know what's going on.
Oh, right.
You're obviously upset. Is there something we can talk about?
Talk? Who, us? What if somebody walked in? They wouldn't recognize us. They'd think they were in the wrong house.
Do you want to talk or not?
Oh, you mean about our dead son? No. We haven't before. Why should we bother now?
What can I do, Ruth?
Forget it, man. Why don't you just go?
What do you want from me?
I want you to stop acting like nothing's happened. That's what I want.
Why? Because I'm not bouncing off the walls?
No, Matt, that would require feelings. We don't want you to hurt yourself.
Do me a favor, Ruth. You want a grieving contest, go find someone else.
Oh, I know how you grieve. Go have another beer.
The hell is that supposed to mean? What do you know? You know nothing. You don't know what I go through.
No, I don't know what you go through, Matt. Or if you go through anything. But that's your choice, dear, not mine.
You're goddamn right it is. My choice is not to scream at the world. Maybe one of us has to be reasonable around here. You ever think of that?
Reasonable? Gee, Matt, I don't know about you, but I miss my son. I'm glad you have time for reason. It's what you imparted to Frank, that sense of reason. Oh, he thought you were very reasonable.
What are you talking about?
Nothing.
Are you saying that I'm the one responsible? Is that it? Well, let me tell you something. You got it backwards.
I know what you think, that I was too lenient, that I let him get away with
Everything! Everything!
Yes, and why? Why did he never come to you?
He wouldn't listen to me, Matt!
No, he wouldn't
didn't trust
listen to
me.
you.
You made
He
sure
wouldn't
of
listen
that.
to you because you never listened to him.
No, but you did. You were winking at him the whole time. You encouraged him. You wanted what he had.
And then it ends with Matt killing Richard,
the ex.
But it's actually comes back, it makes a decision to show him coming back to his house and Ruth beginning to talk to him, that she needed him to, like, that was a way that their relationship could possibly move forward. And in a way, it's all about how people hurt each other.
When I saw this film in the cinema in London, first time I saw it, I came out of it and I just couldn't understand why it was so successful. I mean, it was, for an indie movie, a very small indie movie, it was very successful. It has fantastic performances, I have to say. Cissy Spacek and Tom Wilkinson are really great in it. And the others are all fine. But I was kind of puzzled by it, because for me, I don't buy it. I didn't buy it then, I don't buy it now. What I don't buy about it is that I think the middle act has this lovely, complex study of the debilitating effect of grief, about these, this couple who basically have invested everything in the son, and who's
very pointedly their only son.
Yeah, all of that is amazing. I mean, it really is absolutely terrific. So you get in. So I have no problem with the first act, even though it's a little bit long, and then the second act is absolutely extraordinary study, and you get amazing performances, and it really is. It has a kind of emotional honesty and openness and believability, particularly when they kind of turn on each other. That the point is there's no solution to this. And they attack each other, and then you get this idea that Tom Wilkinson says, which I can just about buy, that maybe in your desperation to somehow find any kind of meaning in your life, given that you're now adrift because of what's happened, you fasten on to the idea that if you kill this person, then in some sense you make sense of what's happened. I think, but the idea of retribution, these two intelligent liberal people, did they ever seriously think, okay, what we need to do is to kill this guy because that is kind of the natural justice of things. There's been some unnatural, the world is out of balance, and so what we need to do is to put it back into balance. So killing him will do that, and I don't believe they think that. Okay, I don't believe those people ever would. If you think he's desperate and he's looking for meaning because his life has lost all meaning, and so he fastens onto a series of actions that simply just give him something to do in some sense, so that he can move forward because he's stuck. I don't really believe that. If you say, okay, what he's trying to do is to make his wife happier, so that in some sense, by doing something, he lives up to some notion of how he should be at that moment. I have no understanding of why he does it, and the logical steps that character goes through to think that's reasonable. Even if he did, the audience doesn't buy that. I don't think killing him is going to make them any more happy than they were before. And at the end, there's a feeling of moving on. And I don't buy that for a moment. I was talking to someone about it, and an American said, you have to understand when that film came out. If you want to know why that film was successful, you have to understand when it came out. And it came out just after 9/11, okay? Where you have a heinous, violent act that deprives people of something they thought was theirs. And there is this urge to strike out and get some kind of payback. There must be some action that can be taken. And this person said to me, what you have to understand about America is that the sense is that you had to have an action. Whether or not the action is justified, invading Iraq, which had nothing to do with it, is not the point. The point is you have to act, because that's just what you have to do. That's in the American, psyche. If a president has said, we're going to do nothing, we can't really say here, this is too complicated. There's no one, whatever. We're going to do nothing at all until we know exactly where we are. And that might take 7 or 8 years. He said that wouldn't have been possible. It simply was not a possible action. This film articulated, this woman told me, at a crucial point in American history, exactly the emotional feelings that America had. There must be some action that can be taken. And if you say what this film is about, it's about a man, it's not what it's about. I think it's about grief, really. But what happens in the story is a man takes action because he has to take action. And you can't really, there's no logical, reason for it. He just has to take action because that's the nature of the man. And he said, that's what the film is about. I can just about buy that. Okay, but at the end, you definitely get a feeling that, you know, things have changed. And I don't believe for a moment that that woman, deprived of her son and her life, would think that killing the man who did it in any way makes that feeling better. And I think anyone who's been bereaved would feel the same thing. You know, it's, you know, it makes, there isn't that logical connection between things. If someone, you know, kills someone you love, or if someone runs over your child with a car, okay, no matter how many times you cut that man up and put him in a mincing machine, your child's not coming back. And actually most people, almost, in my experience, nearly all people who've ever been in that situation, how often do you get the sense of vengeance? It's not something that people tend to go for first in that situation, because they're more involved in the sense of loss, and, you know, that's what grief is really about. And the middle of the film is such a wonderful exploration of grief. I think the end of the film is fatuous. I think it cheapens what the middle of the film is, and it makes me irritated to an intense degree.
I thought this was an episode about thematic intensity, not about irritation intensity. Okay, so I think there's a few things we need to unpack here, because we are broadly speaking about theme. Yeah. So I don't want to get too lost in the woods. For me, but interestingly, the film is provoking this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of almost a genre sequence structure. That, to me, the big fight that culminates the end of the second act is them speaking hurting each other by speaking the truth of who they are to the other person.
You wanted what he had? Her.
Oh my God, you gotta be
kidding! You know it! You wanted it and you couldn't get it. That's why you didn't stop him. So you could get your kicks through your son.
You can't admit the truth to me or to yourself that Frank died for your fantasy piece of ass!
You know, you want to know why our son is dead. You really want to know. He was with her not because of me. He went there because of you. Yes, he did, because you are so controlling, so overbearing, so angry that he was it, that he was our only one.
That is not true!
Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Even when he was a kid, you were telling him how he was always wrong. Oh, I remember. One time you yanked him out of a Little League game and sent him home for throwing his glove in the dirt. He was what? 9 years old? Everything he did was wrong. Well, what was wrong with him, Ruth?
So Ruth Cruise's mat of not lusting, but wanting,
living vicariously through the son,
and that's called out at the beginning, right? And he's not speaking it. His friend is the one who's like, "Don't you want a piece of that ass?" Basically, but you can see he doesn't look away. He's not ashamed. He's a little bit awkward.
No, and then there's this in that first act also the scene where they're in bed. The Matt and what's her name? Matt and Ruth are in bed, and he seduces her, but it's very clear that he's seducing her because he's thinking of his son with.
Okay. And then he goes and visits and visits Natalie after the son has died, and there's this weird, almost flirtatious nature to their interaction there. I interpreted it that way. But I had seen it before, so I think I interpreted it through her understanding of how he was acting. But then he accuses her of, "You are so unforgiving." You know, and earlier he says, "What do you want me to do?" She does not believe that he is grieving because he has not done anything, because the whole second act is the lack of action. There is minute action, like him unpacking the swing and all that stuff. And then that kicks off what begins the third act, which is, in typical thriller, very condensed timeline. It's effectively overnight and high tension where he goes and kidnaps Richard.
Don't talk. Lock the door and get in.
Wait just a minute. Let's calm down. All right.
Part of the character question we're asking at this point is, why is he doing this? You're believing it's retribution, but we sit there and we don't entirely believe that he is capable of doing it. This is my interpretation. And then when he comes back home, And his friend is like, I've got to get home, my wife's going to come up, going to be awake, and I've knocked her out with pills, which they've already very lightly plotted film, but we know that she takes pills, he's obviously giving her a sleeping pill, whatever. He comes home, Ruth is awake, and we're like, oh fuck, he's been caught, which is the thriller feeling. And then she's like, is it done? And his answer is yes. And she's like, great, you must be so hungry.
Did you do it? You must be hungry. Matt? Matt? Do you want coffee?
I'll go and get you food. And so my interpretation of that whole film, and the question, and it is a thematic thing created through juxtaposition, is why did he do it? Which is a character thing, but it's like, I think maybe a character theme question.
Well, it's forcing you to ask.
Because I think he wanted her to forgive him, right? Because part of it is that she blames Kim for what happened because he allowed her son, he didn't support her son, he didn't support her in wanting her son to break up. If only they'd broken up earlier. I don't think they're necessarily going to move on. It's very clear that he's uncomfortable with his actions, but I think he's done it not out of a sense of revenge, but he's wanting forgiveness from his wife. But what is interesting, that is the overarching act question, which is very different from what I think Chaz is going to talk about, which is the second act, which is about the character question. It's almost a character question, which is how do you overcome grief, which is not a plot, like that is not demonstratable, coming back to these ideas. Like, and in fact, maybe the reason that you find the film frustrating, and I don't want to argue about the film because you're obviously entitled to dislike it, and I think it's all valid, is that how do you ever overcome grief? How could you ever dramatize something like overcoming grief?
Are you saying how do you ever dramatize it, or how do you ever overcome it?
Well, I think as the challenge as a writer would be, if we're doing this idea as a plot question, is that it's something that is clearly demonstrable, a question that can be answered in a clearly demonstrable way.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, it is.
I've got two things. So I agree with you, Stephen. I think the third sequence is thematically asking completely different questions from the rest of the film, and I also think it's illogical from a character perspective. But I also think that the writers and director have gone to great lengths to make that work, and I want to kind of put my finger on the different points as to how I think, in my view, they make that work. So in terms of the second act, I think where we're all agreed is that the second act is an incredible piece of thematic work because it's a series of vignettes. It even fades up and fades down from black across these moments of them experiencing grief. They're individual scenes, and they go getting longer and longer, which is almost like the experience of coming out of grief, where you can live life, you can survive longer periods of moment without getting washed over by grief. And they're so incredible that, as Stu, you were talking about how the plot of what's happening with Richard's trial, those plot questions raise up, like, will he get bail? Will he not get bail? Will he be charged for murder? Will he be charged for manslaughter? They come up as plot questions, but they're very quickly dealt with as plot questions, and you just linger in what the characters are experiencing. One of the key moments of that, and hopefully we can play an excerpt of it, is Matt tracks down the prosecutor. He's feeling so unable to act in relation to getting Richard prosecuted that he tracks down the prosecutor at lunch, and he's standing on the street asking the prosecutor what's going on, and the prosecutor's saying there's nothing you can do. And cinematically, Matt starts focusing on the sounds of the prosecutor's watch ticking and the coins jangling in his pocket. It's very much raising character questions, but it's the same character question over and over again. It's, will this couple ever come to terms with the loss of their son? So that whole second act is a series of vignettes where there's not really that many plot questions asked, and there's not really that many, or it's the same character question being asked over and over again. It's allowing the audience, it's forcing the audience to dwell in the moment and to go, what would it be like if I had this experience? And going back to that scene about...
They go away to a lodge, effectively a country lodge, with their good friends. We invited them away because as friends, the friends are like, how do we help our friends in grief?
Yeah.
Right?
We just got to pretend to be normal, I guess.
You know, and they've got the different ways of between Matt and Ruth dealing with grief. Matt and his friend are talking about fishing or whatever.
No, they're chopping up wood and talking about real estate or something.
Yeah. And where and Ruth and her friend are talking about grandkids.
Well, no, they're talking about, I've called it here the fast pass scene, because they're talking about going to an amusement park.
Yeah.
And they're talking about the fast pass. It's like so innocuous until that, as you mentioned before, the woman, the friend says, I guess there's no danger of us dying off. And then suddenly clunk, like those characters are both in the scene where the audience is in. And nearly all of those scenes in the second act are structured like that, where it's kind of like, what are these characters doing in ordinary life? And then the impact of their son's death is brought in clunk in the middle of the scene, and that generates the conflict such as it is.
The inverse, so when there is the showdown between Ruth and Matt, this huge argument, and there's the knock at the door, and he's like, that'd be the police. And it's the little girl selling cookies, the girl guide selling Kit Kat bars.
Yeah.
And it's like, what the and again, it forces you to ask the question of, because you're like, what the fuck is this scene doing here? And the answer is, life is just going on. That's the difficulty of grief, is that everyone else's life continues and they kind of expect you to move on. Life isn't willing to, life doesn't wait for you to get over it.
Yeah. And that interruption is so powerful because it's the culmination. So all those vignettes from the second act are all very much them as individuals, very rarely interacting. And that's the point of that conflict scene. And we'll play excerpts from it. But it's the first time that we're actually seeing them talking about losing their son. And in fact, the fact that they're talking about it is the source of conflict, because they haven't been talking about it up until now. And they're in the midst of that highly heightened conflict. And as you say, they're interrupted by the candy seller. And Matt doesn't ignore it. He goes to the door. He buys candy. It's such a wonderful moment of him like grounding himself back in, that such that he's able to go back into that conflict and achieve resolution from it and admit where he's wrong. But all of that stuff up until that point is about how is this couple going to deal with this grief. And then moving into the next section, Matt takes over, he kidnaps Richard Strout, ends up killing Richard Strout, burying him, and ends up back in the bedroom. Where I agree with you, Stephen, is suddenly that final sequence is asking completely different and new questions that are not easily to define, that are completely different from what the rest of the film has been asking. It's asking films about, like, is violence an answer to grief? Can you ever... is action the answer? Is there? It's hard for me to define because it's so different.
But those are questions that you can say the third act is asking, as it were, because once you've seen the third act.
Yes.
But
in the moment of the third
in the moment of it, what happens is you go from a middle act where basically, as you say, the plotting character questions are much more minimal. So you're kind of living with grief. And really the experience of the second act is living with these characters who are living with grief, and is with a deeper meaning of what must that be like. And then the audience, because there isn't a lot of plot and character, starts going, how would I react? What would I... So again, it's just thing about thematic is bringing the audience to the story. And so you start to think, what would it be like? And how would I get over it? And what must this be like? And you're identifying very strongly emotionally with this stuff. And the question, I suppose, the thematic question is grief, is there any consolation? If you like, is there ever any consolation from grief? Is kind of the question that the second act asks. Then the third act throws you into action. He's doing something, and you're in this kind of thriller. The problem I have with it is that there's a depth and complexity in the second act, which because we've gone, as it were, below the level of plot and below the level of character, to the deeper level of the story, which is the theme and the interface between the ideas of the story, the ideas of the writers and director and etc., and the way the audience understands and thinks about their own lives. And then you go from that to a thriller. So basically you go from a complex story to a simple story. Which is, okay, now the obstacles are simple. What will he do? Will he be successful? Will he make it? Or will it happen the way he wants, or will it not? These are all plot questions.
Yeah, but they've deliberately withheld his plan.
Yeah.
So it's like, what is he actually doing? So when he talks about, I'm going to send you away on the Amtrak, you're like, okay.
Dr. Fowler, it was an accident. I'm going to jail to pay for it. If I ever get out, I'll be an old man. Isn't that enough?
You're not going to jail. Pack clothes for warm weather.
You're gonna let me go?
You're gonna jump bail. see, it's the trial. We can't go through that, my wife and I. That's why you're leaving. I've got you a ticket. My wife keeps seeing you. I can't have that anymore.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler.
You genuinely believe that that's
You're
his
behind
actual...
the character. It's still thriller stuff.
You're in a thriller.
You are in a thriller, but it's still pushing you to ask questions of the character.
But here's
But you're not asking the question, or you are.
The
question,
what is he
I'm
doing?
asking the question. Not I'm asking as you're watching this unfold. Okay, you realise it's a thriller, and you realise there's probably some sinister plan. There's more to going on than you've got to watch very carefully because you're kind of working it out. The question I'm asking watching it is, in what way is any of this that's happening, which I kind of understand, even though I don't know the detail of it, but that detail will be revealed to me. In what way is this action in any way an answer or a companion piece to the deeper question of is there ever any consolation? And if the answer is, in this situation, yes, because he killed him, then I don't believe that. I think it's a silly answer. And you say, well, the film isn't doing that. Fine. But you've flipped into, I think the problem is that when you get to this thematic level, you get to a level of deep complexity because you're bringing, all sorts, it's the interface between the character and the audience, the story and the audience, it's the filmmakers who are asking deep questions about the story to the audience, which they're then responding to emotionally. And then you as well lift the story out of that complex world into a simpler world of the thriller and the plot and stuff. And whilst I understand it and get it, the question I'm always asking is, okay, but what, now that we've asked some deep questions, why am I being showed this simpler world? The only acceptable answer is because in some way it will extend or inform or help those deeper questions. And if it doesn't, then what's it for? It's just, and for me, I just can go, the deep questions at the end of Act 2 are really complex and interesting. I watch all of Act 3, I get it. I understand what they're doing. It's beautifully done as a kind of piece of thriller construction. It's very nicely organised. But the deep question the story is asking is, where's the consolation? And then I look at Act 3 and say, what's the answer that Act 3 gives us? And I don't know. I don't know if it gives any answer.
Can I? All right. My rebuttal to that is, I agree with you to the sense that it does actually conflict with the story that it's built so far, because if they had at any point shown the scene where the husband and wife sit down together and she says, you know what will make me feel better is if you kidnap this guy and kill him and bury him in the woods, and he goes, okay, I'll go and do that, it would have made no sense whatsoever.
Why wouldn't it have worked?
It's completely against all the character that you've built up.
Because we've shown them not talking to each other. This is people not talking about their...
But I think it's against who they are as people that they've presented in terms of who their choices are.
So what you're saying is the third act is a construction which is designed in order to keep away from the audience the truth, which is that the things they're doing are not true to the characters that we've seen in the second act.
That's not quite what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that what the writers and director have done quite masterfully is, I think, kept you in the moment in the same way that Exterminating Angel and Love Actually keep you in the moment. That third act sequence keeps you in the moment so that you're not thinking about it in terms of the larger story in that. And going back to what you were saying, Stu, about their plan, so we've never had the scene where the couple plan it out. You've never had the scene where Matt and his friend who he's doing the murder with, come up with a plan. As Matt is kidnapping Richard, he's explaining, I'm going to make you skip bail. I'm going to get you out of the country. And I think in that moment, as an audience member experiencing it for the first time, you genuinely believe that that's what he's trying to do. Because going back to your question about, does the wife believe that killing him will bring her consolation? I don't believe that at all. What her conflict is that she's wondering about her life. And in difference to people who've experienced loss of a child, let's say through a car accident or whatever, they're not constantly butting up against the person who took their child away from them. So the conflict that the wife has is this guy who murdered her son, or killed her son, sorry.
No, she believes in murder. Yeah. That's the point.
Okay.
That's part of the...
Is in her daily life. And she cannot live like that. And so we're in this moment where ostensibly the dialogue between Richard and Matt is, I'm getting you out of my wife's life. Then Matt shoots Richard. And I buy that in the moment because he's like, we've seen this quite extended sequence of Matt continually saying, don't talk to me, you buy that when you are sitting in close proximity with the person you believe murdered your son, you are constantly restraining yourself from
And we
killing
see
him.
leading a life. We had seen that in shots earlier with Ruth seeing him with a girl, him at the shops, goes to the house. He's got quite a nice house. It's got artwork. It's got a photo of him and Natalie. He's got the life that is deprived of your son. So I understand in the moment.
So in the moment, you totally buy that Matt's plan might have been, I'm going to get you out, but I actually succumb to my emotions and I shoot you, right?
And the film plays into that. His friend says, this wasn't the plan.
Exactly. And that's the moment where it changes, right? Because that's the moment where you realize as an audience member that the plan was to murder him.
No, because it's a double beat. His friend says, that wasn't your plan. And you're like, oh, he wasn't meant to murder him. And then his friend was meant to do it in the woods. And you're like, okay, that's the plan. And then the question becomes, does his wife know? And then the answer is yes.
Okay.
And then the wife is like, cool, I'm going to cook you breakfast now.
Exactly.
Because that's her way of relating.
But I'm saying all of this works in the moment, but none of it works when you step back and think about who these characters are across the larger film.
So what you're saying is it works in the moment, but actually if you think of the story as a whole, it makes no sense emotionally.
But, and this is what I'm going to say, the fact that we're having this discussion shows that the film is working thematically. It's making us ask these questions and debate and ask these questions. And I think the film is deliberately refusing to answer those. And and I'm not one of those people, like, you know how you see those, oh, you just didn't get it. Like, if you don't like something, it's like, you can get something and not like it. You can go, I get that the film is asking these questions. I just don't like it. Like, I don't like that it's asking those questions.
What I think is, but the point I'm making, I think, even though I do agree that not all that stuff, but the point I'm making is that the middle story is thematic. Once you get to a thematic level of story, once you say we get away the plot and character stuff, we allow the theme to rise up, you're basically playing the story in all its elements. Plot, character and theme are all, as it were, above the surface and playing. You get a level of complexity. Once you, as it were, drive the theme under the surface again, which I think the third act does, it becomes simpler. And anything the characters do if you revert to, as it were, a plotted story, simply seems simplistic in relation to the second act. My problem is I don't think there's anything that you could do as we're in a thriller world. You know, even if he'd have decided to kill him and then decided not to kill him, for example, and let him go, I don't think that would have been satisfactory either to me, because it's kind of like, the fact is, what the second act dramatizes really well is that there is no is that there's action is not doing things doesn't make grief stop, if you like, in very simple terms. And the third act is all about doing things. You see what I mean? Yeah. And for me, that's the issue, that I think that once you get, and this is the thing to be aware of if you're writing thematically, if you're bringing theme to the surface, is that you get to a level of complexity that you can't, as it were, go back to a previous level. You've unfolded the story in a certain way, and then you have to answer it in a certain way. If you watch Amour...
Which we analysed in a previous episode.
If you watch in relation to in the bedroom, you see the difference between a filmmaker who gets what you have to do if you get to that level of thematic complexity, you know, and how you have to follow it all the way down the line.
What I think is interesting about the film, and maybe this is not the observation you're back, we haven't talked a lot about the first act. And I think what is interesting about the first act is, even though it's kind of romance, it's very lightly plotted in the sense that the question is, the parents want him to break up with this girl. Will he break up with her? And then he talks about how it's not...
There's other questions about, like, will he go to college?
Yeah.
Will he follow the life they want him to lead?
It's all very light. He says it's a summer thing, but his actions are in contradiction.
She's such a brave girl.
That's it. You're driving me nuts, Mom. I've had lots of girlfriends, and I don't understand why this one is any different.
I know you don't.
We're not serious, Mom.
No?
No. It's a summer thing.
I see.
But part of it, and perhaps it being slightly long, is you're like, why am I being shown this? Right? Like, why? Why am I spending so much time with this? But there is the moment, the kind of almost the centerpiece of the first act, where they have the thematic speech.
Oh, boy. You see what happened to this poor fellow?
What?
Oh, look, he lost an arm. See, the trap has nylon nets called heads to his side side heads to let the lobster crawl in. And inside, they call a bedroom head. Hold the bait and keeps them from escaping. You know the old saying, two's company, three's a crowd? No, it's like that. You get more than two of these in the bedroom, and chances are something like that's gonna happen. That's why Frank can't leave these traps for more than a day.
This is exactly what happens in the film. Multiple times, each act or each phase of the story is actually about that in different ways. But it's actually not a very complex idea, like the film states it, and it's in the title. And in fact, the film is drawing attention by, people talk about using their title like a line from the script in the title. It actually draws attention to itself. It says, this is the theme of the film. Love actually does it, but it's very light. And maybe your reaction to In the Bedroom is that it's not as profound as it kind of thinks it is.
Well, not as profound as it gets to. It almost like winds back on its profundity, to use a Billy Connolly term. But talking about the title, what's amazing, the opening scene of the film is the two lovers, Nick Stahl and Marissa Tomei, Frank and Natalie, running through a meadow. You can't hear what they're saying. It's like a very Nicholas Sparks thing, two lovers running through a sunny meadow, and then it cuts to In the Bedroom on black. Like, they're not in a bedroom. No, it's so conflictual, like contrast, right? And then the final scene, as you said, is Matt comes back, Ruth asks, is it done? So suddenly you realize that Ruth and Matt have been talking about this, planning this, and she goes and says, she treats him with a measure of forgiveness that she has not shown him through the rest of the film by saying, I'll go and make you breakfast, right? So there's this, the film is presenting you with an idea that in a way, this violence has helped her come to terms with the murder of her son. But there's some fascinating staging. First of all, a lot of that dialogue is happening with just a shot of the staircase. She's walked down the staircase and walked out a shot, and it just lingers on the staircase. Neither of them are in shot, and you're hearing them talk to each other. It's like there's an emptiness to it. And then the final shot, the final two shots of the scene, one is on Matt listening to his wife. He's taking a Band-Aid off his finger where a lobster has cut him, and you get no feeling that this murder has resolved his grief. So I don't think it's I don't think the third act, the questions that the third act raises are encounter to the second act questions, but I do think they are different questions, and that's where there's perhaps a thematic confusion.
Yeah, I agree. The thematic, for me, I mean, I don't want to go on about it. I've said what I said. But I think, for example, if you have characters of that complexity in the second act who are in that much pain, who understand the world so much, and then we're asked to believe that at the same time, we haven't been seeing it, but at the same time they said, well, we could kill him. And that woman has never thought, for example, that he has a mother, that she will be going through the same pain that she's going through, that she's incapable of that kind of empathy. That character in the second act is absolutely capable of empathy, yet she can't be allowed to feel that empathy because the plot wouldn't work if she did.
But
and I think that's the kind of thing in
that's
development.
Why they made it look like it goes.
Yeah, it's a trick.
But that's why, from the craft perspective, they have not
to
done
hide
that.
the problem.
Yeah, that's why, from a craft perspective.
But what I would say is solve the problem. We can hide the problem. That's not good writing. Good writing isn't hiding problem. Good writing good writing is about, okay, if we want this level of character complexity and thematic complexity, where do we take the story? And the answer in this story is we need them to kill him because that's what we want. Not that's a natural outflowing of those characters in that situation. That, for me, is the issue.
But it's not uncommon for films, particularly a lot of films, to end into bloodshed as a way of kind of resolving the stories. I mean, we talked about Get Out being thematically complex, but it still ends with him running around killing everyone.
They fall back into the genre resolution of the...
So, and in Get Out, the last 20 minutes are the least interesting part of the story.
But also in Get Out, it's set up in that genre. I'd say that's different to In the Bedroom, where the last 20 minutes are completely different conventionally to everything else.
If you want to see the first 2/3 of the film being like Ingmar Bergman, this kind of very meditative, patient, lots of moments of reflection. There is that great moment just before it transitions into the third act with the girls singing, and it gives you these moments where you can mediate on what you have seen, and then it turns into a thriller. And he, I doubt Bergman hasn't done a thriller like that. I'm wondering if there's some way that we can kind of wrap up our learnings, because what's interesting to me is even though we talked about this idea of sequences, and when I got into it, originally I was like, oh, there's going to be a sequence in the same way there's a plotted sequence. And I think some films do that, like Apocalypse Now. And I personally like the idea of, okay, you can have a hybrid thematic character, thematic plot, thematic imagistic sequence. But what is interesting is there are other ways to raise theme outside of, it's still structural, but it's not necessarily sequential. In the Bedroom does it through the juxtaposition of genre sequences, though it doesn't necessarily have a sequence itself that is thematic. But the juxtaposition, it might have moments where you can consider theme, but it's the juxtaposition itself. Love Actually has done it between different stories, and Brunel almost, Mr. B, has kind of done it in The Exterminating Angel, like almost as the whole.
Yeah. I think the important thing to say is that, you know, we've talked about it in a fairly abstracted way today, but you know, you say of certain stories, well, what's the plot question? What drives that film? Or what's the character question that drives that film? It's a character-driven film. We say The Exterminating Angel is a thematically driven film. Can you say, what is the thematic question? And I think, yes, there is a thematic question that you can define the same way you can define a plot question or a character question. For me, the thematic question that drives The Exterminating Angel is, will the audience understand that the bourgeoisie, if they do not change the way they understand and relate to the world, will ultimately be destroyed by their own self-abnegation? It's a complex question, okay, and it's not to do with the events primarily in the story of the film. It's to do with what the film makes the audience think. So your thematic question is not, as it were, contained within the boundaries of the story, unlike plot and character questions, which are, because the theme, when it's raised, is about making the audience understand and ask other questions themselves. So it's going to be a question that is, as it were, on the interface of the events that the story, or the things that the story makes the audience think about, and what the audience thinks about. And that connects also, of course, to what the filmmaker is trying to make the audience think about. So a thematic question is really more a question that is articulating what the filmmaker wishes the audience to understand and think about, as opposed to what's in the story itself. Its ambitions are more than just contained within the story. And that's the truth. Same is true of a sequence. The Apocalypse Now, so what's the sequence question of that thing is, will Francis Ford Coppola, by showing us these men watching the Playboy bunnies dance, make the audience question the logic and sanity of the American presence in Vietnam? That, I would say, is the as it were, thematic question. And it's not about will they do this in the story. It's bigger than that. It's always bigger than the story. And that's a fundamental difference between plot and character questions and thematic questions. But they are posed, explored and answered within the time scale of the sequence, or in time, just as other sequence questions are.
I think my key learnings from this exercise is, one, just pure and simply, if you want to bring your theme to the surface of a movie, just take some time and remove plot and character. And in The Bedroom, after the murder, they're driving back into town from this camp out in the woods, and it's just cuts to a montage of through the window of the houses going by. And because I was looking at the film through this lens, I realized that the filmmakers were very deliberately saying, you're just looking at houses right now. There is no plot. There is no character. Think about everything you've just...
I think there's a bit of plot, which is, it's about getting home in time, but it's very minimal.
There is, but they didn't need to cut to a montage of houses being driven by. And they then, after the very last shot of the film is actually the town. It's a montage of shots of the town getting steadily further and further away. I've been fascinated by two things from this homework. One is, all right, if I want to make the theme of my film clear, just pull back on plot and character. But the other is also, you can make a very thematic film, but if you're going to do it, the level of craft you have to do to keep the audience hooked in terms of micro plotting that they do in Love Actually and The Exterminating Angel is actually incredible. Like the amount of questions I wrote down watching The Exterminating Angel, like, why is there a dead bird in the woman's purse? Or why is she throwing the glass through the window? Or all those kind of things. He doesn't bother to answer them, but he's deliberately raised them because he's got some instinctive feel for when the audience needs to be leaning into the story and asking a question.
example of these things are, because I mean it's a great example of, you know, if you want to not do something, you have to know what you need to do in order to not do it. It's kind of like, you know, we were talking about before, Picasso can paint anything he wants, but he chooses to draw like that. But it's not because he can't do anything else, it's because he can do everything else that he's able to do that. And that's the same with Buñuel. Because he's such a good filmmaker, he can make a film that kind of seems to break an awful lot of rules, but still kind of holds together. You have to understand deeply the kind of craft that you're playing with, because it's very sophisticated kind of filmmaking. Very briefly, I think the difference between an art house and a multiplex film is that art house movies are less interested in always driving the plot and character hard. And so you tend to get more sections in those kinds of movies where the plot and character is eased off, so the theme comes through more. And that's simply, you know, that means you can think more about who the filmmaker is and what they're trying to say, and that steps you slightly outside the story. And whereas, you know, your driven commercial movie is always about keeping the audience in the story.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-0.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.
What's this war in the heart of nature? Why does nature vie with itself? The land contend with the sea. Is there an avenging power in nature? Not one power, but two?